What if the ground beneath your feet could remember the footsteps that once pressed into it? What if the soil still held something of the men who crouched there, who breathed there, who listened for sounds that might mean their last breath was coming? On a quiet European dawn, in fields that have long since returned to grass and wildflower, the mist settles into old foxholes as though it has been doing so every morning for 80 years. And in a way, it has. The earth there remembers. Not with consciousness, but with the simple, patient memory that soil keeps of the weight placed upon it, the blood returned to it, the stories pressed into it, layer by layer. This is where we begin our journey through the night. Not with fanfare or urgency, but with the understanding that two very different armies once stood in opposition across ground like this. Armies that had been built, trained, and armed according to philosophies so distinct that they might have been designed by different species rather than different nations. The German Wehrmacht infantry and the American Expeditionary Forces infantry were not simply on opposite sides of a conflict. They represented two entirely different answers to a fundamental question: what is an infantryman, and how should he be made? If you've ever wondered how history's greatest power struggles were actually carried out on the ground, by men with rifles and grenades and fear in their chests, then please consider subscribing for more slow, deeply researched documentaries like this one, stories that explore the complete history of German and American infantry in World War II, two armies that fought nothing alike, unfolding through the quiet hours when the mind is most receptive to understanding the texture of the past. The field itself is silent now. What was once the sharp crack of the MG42, that devastating German machine gun that seemed to fire faster than human thought, has given way to the wind moving through grain. What were once the sharp reports of the M1 Garand, the semi-automatic rifle that every American infantryman carried and that made a distinctive ping when its clip ejected, has faded into memory. But the field remembers the difference between these sounds, even if only the mist knows it. In the decades since the last shot was fired across European hedgerows and into German forests, we have come to understand these two armies almost as abstract concepts. We think of German discipline, of American industrial might. We imagine one as mechanically perfect, the other as creatively adaptable. Yet if we are truly to understand what divided these forces, we must move past the mythology and step into the actual soil. We must imagine the specific weight of a German recruit's wool tunic in winter rain, and the specific way an American soldier's cotton uniform clung to his body in the humidity of a Normandy June. We must consider not just the grand strategies of generals, but the actual experience of kneeling in mud, of waiting in darkness, of wondering whether the next shell would have your name on it or pass by to find someone else's. The mist continues to settle. In the Eastern Front's endless expanses, German infantrymen, called Lancers by those who served, endured a grinding attrition that few forces in human history have had to absorb. They fought across territory so vast that the maps themselves seemed unreal, and they did so with an army built on principles of rigid hierarchy, mission-based tactics, and a tradition of infantry warfare that stretched back through the Prussian military academies to an older, more distant past. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the American infantry was being forged in the furnace of a different kind of war entirely. American soldiers came from a nation that had built its military on the assumption that mass, standardization, and material abundance could achieve victory. Where the German army asked its men to do more with less, the American army asked its men to work as interchangeable parts in a vast machine. Where German infantry doctrine emphasized the autonomy of small unit leaders and the quick decision-making required in fluid, infiltrating attacks, American doctrine was still learning, still adapting, still discovering what infantry warfare meant in the context of modern industrial combat. These differences did not emerge from the characters of individual men, nor even from the strategic visions of distant commanders. They emerged from history itself, from the ground these nations stood on, the revolutions they had experienced or avoided, the industrial capacities they possessed, the defeats they had suffered. The German infantry, for all its reputation for precision, was born from an imperial tradition, shaped by the collapse of that empire, hardened in the forgotten conflicts that preceded the Great War, and then rebuilt according to doctrines that believed in decisive action and the supremacy of the trained, professional soldier. The American infantry emerged from a very different soil, from a tradition of the citizen soldier, from the assumption that any man could be taught to fight, from a nation that had never truly believed war would be its constant companion. Now, in this stillness before dawn breaks fully across the abandoned field, we might ask, what made these differences real? Not in theory, not in doctrine manuals filed away in archives, but in the actual experience of standing in formation, of receiving orders, of learning to kill and to survive. How did an infantryman come to understand his place in the machine of war differently, depending on which nation had claimed him? These are not academic questions. They shaped the course of battles. They determined who lived and who died. They changed the world. The mist clings to the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a bird calls. The kind of ordinary sound that must have seemed like a miracle to men who had spent months hearing only explosions, gunfire, the cries of the wounded. In the night ahead, we will walk through that transformation together. We will move from the training grounds where these armies were built, through their first encounters in distant theaters, and into the grinding intensity of the European campaign, where these two utterly different approaches to infantry warfare finally collided. We will rest in the details, the weight of boots, the taste of rations, the sound of officers shouting orders in two different languages. We will understand, through the slow unfolding of historical truth, how two nations fought the same war in profoundly different ways. But for now, let us simply sit in this field at dawn and consider the silence. Let us remember that every foxhole in this earth was dug by someone's hands and filled by someone's body, and abandoned eventually when the war moved on and the mist returned to settle into it once more. The grass has grown tall again, the world has moved forward, but the ground remembers everything, and in remembering, it teaches. If you find yourself drawn to this kind of slow, layered examination of military history, the kind that moves past dates and statistics to ask deeper questions about how entire armies were built, trained, and sent into circumstances that demanded everything from them, you might consider subscribing to this channel. We explore stories like this one with the care they deserve, moving through carefully researched details at a pace that lets each element settle into understanding rather than rushing toward conclusions. There's something quite particular about this approach to military documentary, one that respects both the historical accuracy and the human presence beneath the uniforms and equipment. More documentaries like this one, on the contrasting philosophies and practices of German and American infantry forces, are coming, each one designed to be thorough without being hurried, to illuminate without overwhelming. The kind of content where you can genuinely learn something in the quietness of the evening hours, where the research comes through in the breathing room between sentences rather than in the urgency of delivery. What draws many listeners to this kind of history is precisely that it doesn't treat warfare as a series of dramatic moments, but rather as a condition that required the organization of millions of ordinary people into systems, and the question of how those systems differed tells you something profound about the societies that built them. The German and American infantries that faced each other across Europe during the Second World War were products of entirely different historical legacies, different industrial capacities, different philosophies about how human beings should be organized for combat. And when you look closely at those differences, not to judge them, but simply to understand them, you begin to see patterns that echo through the rest of history. Consider for a moment how rarely we pause to ask, why did these two armies train their soldiers differently? Why did they equip them differently? Why did the basic unit of German infantry revolve around the machine gun while the American basic unit was built around the semi-automatic rifle? These weren't arbitrary choices. They emerged from decades of military thinking, from the materials available, from the population structures of the nations involved, from the philosophies that the leaderships of those nations held about what soldiers were and what they should become. The deeper you explore these questions, the more you realize that an army isn't just a collection of weapons and tactics. It's an expression of a nation's character, its strengths, its constraints, its assumptions about human nature and organization. And when two such different armies finally met in the hedgerows of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes, what emerged was a contest not just of hardware, but of entire worldviews about how warfare should be conducted. This channel is dedicated to exploring that kind of history. The slow history, the thinking history, the kind that requires patience and attention but repays both with genuine understanding. Each documentary we create takes time to unfold, because that's how complicated systems unfold in real life. They don't announce themselves all at once. They reveal themselves gradually, through the accumulated weight of small decisions, through the layers of preparation and philosophy that preceded the moment of contact. If this fascinates you, if you find yourself wanting to understand not just what happened in history, but why the people involved made the choices they made, then this channel offers a particular kind of companionship for those evening hours when the world slows down and thinking becomes possible. The subscription costs nothing but your attention, and in return you receive access to more deeply researched, carefully paced explorations of military history that treat the subject with the seriousness it deserves. Now, having set that intention, we can turn toward the central architecture of our exploration for tonight. What begins to emerge, as we move deeper into this history, is something almost paradoxical. Two nations, both modern industrial powers, both facing the same enemy across the same continent. Yet they built their infantry forces as if they were solving entirely different problems. And that difference, that fundamental divergence in philosophy, would echo through every engagement from the Polish forests to the Rhine. Consider for a moment the simple fact that an army is not born whole. It is grown from soil, from memory, from the particular accidents of geography and culture that shape a people's understanding of what strength means. The German infantryman did not emerge from nowhere. He carried within him, whether he knew it or not, centuries of Prussian discipline, of the rigid belief that an army's power lay in the absolute unity of will, in each man becoming a part of a greater mechanism. The American infantryman, by contrast, came from a nation that had spent most of its existence reluctant to maintain a standing army at all. These were fundamentally different inheritances. And so the question that unfolds across this night, as we trace the development of both forces, is this: how did these inherited philosophies translate into actual structures, into the weapons they chose, into the way they trained their young men to kill and to survive? Because a choice to emphasize one kind of firepower over another is not merely tactical, it is philosophical. It says something about what a nation believes about human beings, about discipline, about the value of individual initiative versus collective obedience. It says something about abundance and scarcity, about industrial capacity, about how you imagine warfare itself will be fought. The Germans, for instance, looked at the problem of infantry firepower and came to a very specific conclusion, that the future of warfare lay in the machine gun, not as a supplementary weapon, but as the very heart of infantry organization. Everything else, in their view, would serve the gun. This was not random. It emerged from their experience in the First World War, from watching entire armies grind to stasis against the dominance of sustained automatic fire. They asked themselves, what if we do not try to overwhelm the machine gun, but rather make it the foundation of our own power? What if we organize our entire infantry squad around it? The Americans, by contrast, had inherited a different tradition. They came from a frontier culture, from a nation that had always believed, or wanted to believe, in the power of the individual marksman. And when they modernized their infantry in the years before the Second World War, they did something quite different. They gave every man in a squad a semi-automatic rifle, not as a supplementary tool, but as the primary source of firepower. This too was a philosophy, a belief, perhaps, that democracy in arms looked like giving each soldier the means to be effective, rather than binding them into absolute dependence on a central weapon. These choices ripple outward. They shape not just how a soldier fights on a single day, but how entire armies must move, how they think about spacing and cover, how they relate to one another under fire. And so to ask how the German infantry was built is to ask, what did they believe? What did they fear? What resources did they have? And the same questions turn toward America. These were not abstract philosophical exercises happening in officer schools and general staff offices. They were choices that would cost lives, that would determine whether a man lived or died in a frozen forest or a hedgerow. And beneath all of this lies something even more fundamental. War, as a human phenomenon, never exists in isolation. It does not descend from heaven as a pure test of force against force. It emerges from societies, from economies, from the particular way a nation has learned to organize itself in peace. Germany in the 1930s was a nation that had experienced hyperinflation, defeat, and internal fracture. It had rebuilt itself through a very specific kind of discipline and mobilization. Its army reflected that. America, by contrast, was a continental nation with seemingly inexhaustible resources. It had never truly mobilized before. When it did, it carried that abundance with it into every aspect of military life. So as we move forward through this history, what we are really doing is learning to read an army as if it were a kind of text, a document written in flesh and steel and doctrine, telling us the story of the nation that created it. The German infantryman will teach us something about hierarchy, about the power of the collective, about what happens when a nation decides that unity of purpose is the highest virtue. The American infantryman will teach us something about improvisation, about the belief that the individual soldier might sometimes know better than the manual, about the power that comes from having enough ammunition, enough food, enough of everything to experiment and adapt. Both were brave. Both were often terrified. Both endured things that should not be endured. But they endured them differently. They thought about their work differently. They moved across the land differently. And in understanding those differences, we begin to understand something true, not just about these two armies, but about war itself. That it is never purely a matter of tactics or technology, but always a reflection of the societies that wage it. The infantry that marches across a battlefield carries the entire history of its nation with it, invisible but present, shaping every choice, every moment of hesitation or courage. To understand the German infantrymen of World War II, we must travel backward through time, past the roaring streets of the Third Reich, past the shame and rebellion of Weimar, to the very foundation of European military culture itself. We must stand, if only in imagination, on the drill fields of Prussia in the 18th century, where something was born that would shape everything that came after, something that felt, to those who inherited it, like simply the way things had always been done. The Prussian army, you see, was not merely a military organization. It was a state within a state, almost a religion unto itself. King Frederick the Great understood something fundamental about warfare and discipline. that an army could be forged into something far greater than the sum of its individual men, but only through an almost ruthless attention to collective precision. On those vast, flat parade grounds, soldiers were drilled not until they understood orders intellectually, but until their bodies obeyed them, before their minds could even process the command. It became muscle memory. It became instinct. It became, over generations, something that felt like national character. This was radical for its time. While other European armies relied heavily on aristocratic officers commanding peasant conscripts through brute force and fear, the Prussian system went deeper. It created hierarchies of responsibility. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers were trained to understand not just the what of their orders, but the why, the underlying tactical principle. This meant that when communication broke down on a chaotic battlefield, a German soldier did not stand frozen, waiting for new instructions. He understood the mission, he understood his role within it, and he acted. This philosophy, this inherited way of thinking about discipline and obedience, did not vanish with Prussia's transformation into the German Empire, nor did it disappear in the aftermath of the First World War. Indeed, it endured through one of the most humiliating defeats in modern history. After 1918, the Treaty of Versailles imposed extraordinary constraints on German military power. The army was limited to 100,000 men, tanks were forbidden, aircraft were forbidden, heavy artillery was restricted. It was a deliberate attempt to render Germany militarily harmless for generations. Yet something remarkable happened in those constrained years, the Reichswehr period, from 1919 until the rise of Hitler. Because every single soldier, every single officer in that small 100,000-man army had to count, had to represent excellence. The Reichswehr became, paradoxically, a crucible of military thought and innovation. Brilliant officers, men who had survived the trenches and learned terrible lessons from them, studied the nature of modern warfare with intellectual intensity. They wrote doctrines. They theorized about how small, well-trained forces could achieve disproportionate effect through superior leadership, coordination, and psychological advantage. They did not have the luxury of relying on mass and attrition. They had to be smarter. This is where the seeds of blitzkrieg were planted, not in some evil genius's mind, but in the desperate intellectual labor of professional soldiers trying to make sense of industrial warfare and their nation's constraints. Heinz Guderian, Erwin Rommel, and others studied not just German tradition, but foreign military theory. They read about tanks. They imagined how mechanized warfare might work. And underneath all of this innovation ran that deep current of Prussian discipline and mission-oriented thinking. How could new technology be married to old doctrinal excellence? By the time the Reichswehr's restrictions were lifted in the early 1930s and the Wehrmacht began its rapid expansion, something precious had been preserved and then amplified. The new soldiers, the young men conscripted during rearmament, inherited not just uniforms and rifles, but an entire philosophical approach to military service. They were taught that the collective was everything, yes, but they were also taught something more subtle, that within that collective, individual understanding mattered. You were not simply a cog in a machine. You were trained to think one level above your rank, to understand the mission, to respond to changing circumstances with initiative tempered by discipline. The junior officers and NCOs of the Wehrmacht in particular were selected and trained with exceptional care. They attended schools. They studied tactics. They were expected to embody both the rigidity of hierarchy and the flexibility of tactical intelligence. This was not unique to Germany, perhaps, but it was done with particular intensity and systematization. A Wehrmacht Unteroffizier, a sergeant, was a different creature from a sergeant in many other armies. He was not merely enforcing orders. He was expected to be a tactical thinker in miniature, capable of commanding his squad or section with some autonomy, while still remaining absolutely subordinate to the larger strategic vision. Consider what this meant in practice. When a German infantry unit came under fire, when communications were disrupted, when officers fell, the structure did not collapse into confusion, because every man had been trained to understand not just obedience but purpose. The squad leader knew not only his own mission, but the missions of adjacent squads. The squad members understood, at some deep level, the role of their machine gun or their rifle within the larger framework of the platoon's firepower. There was a kind of distributed intelligence throughout the organization, held together by shared doctrine and inherited discipline. This was the gift, if we can call it that centuries of Prussian military culture had bequeathed to the Wehrmacht. It was not evil in itself. It was not inherently Nazi. It was a way of thinking about warfare, about coordination, about the relationship between individual and collective. In the hands of professional soldiers with their own moral compass, it might have been simply a very effective military system. But of course, it was placed in the hands of a regime that understood exactly how to exploit it, how to channel that disciplined obedience toward catastrophic ends. What is perhaps most striking, as we sit with this thought in the quiet of the evening, is how deeply this Prussian inheritance had penetrated into the German soul by the time of the Second World War. A young man conscripted in 1939, born perhaps in 1920, had never known anything but this system. He was taught in school by teachers who had served in the First World War, who thought in these categories of duty and hierarchy. He entered the Wehrmacht as something almost foreordained. The discipline was not imposed from outside. It was already inside, waiting to be activated. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the German infantry as they prepared to face their American counterparts. They were not simply a better trained army, though they were that. They were the inheritors of a military tradition so old, so deeply woven into national consciousness, that it had become almost invisible to them. It was simply the way one was a soldier. It was simply how things were done. And that made them formidable, and that made them tragic, in equal measure. The American army that would eventually face the Wehrmacht across European battlefields was born not from centuries of Prussian drill yards, but from something altogether different. A nation that had spent the better part of 2 decades trying very hard to be small. In the years between the wars, while Germany was secretly rearming in defiance of Versailles, the United States Congress was passing laws to prevent rearmament altogether. The National Defense Act of 1920 had created a peacetime standing army of around 300,000 men, yet by the 1930s, that number had shrunk further still, sometimes dipping below 180,000 soldiers across the entire continental force. To put this in perspective, the German Wehrmacht, even in the early stages of its clandestine expansion, was building towards something vastly larger. America's infantry was threadbare by comparison, underfunded, spread thin across a nation with no immediate existential threat. Young men enlisted for lack of better options during the Great Depression, not from any national emergency. The army they joined was a small professional corps, not quite a national institution, more a practical career for those who needed steady work. And yet, embedded in this small peacetime force was an idea, one that would prove far more American than any European tradition. It was the concept of the citizen soldier, the notion that in a democracy, war was not the province of a hereditary military caste, but rather the temporary calling of ordinary people. This idea reached back to the founding of the nation itself, to militias and farmers who picked up rifles when needed, then returned to their fields. It was romantic, perhaps naively so, but it carried real weight in American political consciousness. When conscription finally came in 1940, still before America entered the war, it came clothed in language about civic duty and temporary service, not eternal military obligation. Draftees were promised they would return to their lives once the emergency had passed. This fundamentally shaped the kind of army America would build, an army of men who did not expect to be soldiers forever, men who had jobs and families waiting, men who needed to understand not just how to follow orders, but why those orders made sense. This difference in origin created a different kind of hierarchy in the American mind. German officers and NCOs were expected to be authorities, figures of unquestioned command, molded by traditions that stretched back generations. American officers and sergeants, by contrast, often came from the same towns, the same schools, the same economic circumstances as their men. They were elevated temporarily, not transformed into a separate caste. This created a different texture in how commands were given and received. An American sergeant explaining an order might pause to let his men understand the objective, might even be questioned in ways unthinkable in a German squad. It was less efficient by some measures, perhaps more fragile under pressure, but it was also more resilient in unexpected ways, as men who understood the reasoning behind their orders could adapt when circumstances changed and no officer was nearby to give new instructions. As the 1930s wore on, and war in Europe became less theoretical, the American military began its slow, somewhat chaotic transformation. The small peacetime army had to become something else entirely, and the instruments of that transformation were not the drill fields and barracks of established tradition, but rather the great industrial capacity of American manufacturing. Germany was rearming through state direction, through military workshops and controlled factories overseen by the War Ministry. America was about to wage war through capitalism, through the mobilization of private industry, on a scale no nation had ever attempted. Factories that built automobiles would build tanks. Machine shops that made parts for refrigerators would make parts for rifles. This was not a sudden shift but a gradual opening of doors, a reluctant expansion of contracts, a nation slowly recognizing that preparation was no longer optional. The training infrastructure that grew up to accommodate millions of new soldiers reflected this industrial sensibility. Where German military training had evolved from centuries of tradition, American training was standardized, documented, broken down into component steps that could be repeated thousands of times across dozens of camps. There was a manual for how to teach a man to fire a rifle, a manual for how to teach him to throw a grenade, manuals for everything. This may sound cold compared to the proud traditions of German military instruction, but consider what it meant in practice. Thousands of instructors, many of them young men themselves recently promoted from the ranks, could follow the same basic curriculum. Training camps sprang up across the country. Fort Benning in Georgia, Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, hundreds of others, and within them, the vast machinery of American military training began to turn. Young men arrived from cities and farms, from factories and schools, often speaking different languages and carrying wildly different assumptions about authority, hierarchy, and discipline. The army that trained them did not try to erase these differences, as the German system attempted to do, but rather to channel them, to teach them a common language of commands and responses, a shared understanding of how to move together without requiring them to become something fundamentally new. There was a kind of optimism embedded in this approach, a belief that Americans, given clear instruction and adequate equipment, could be trained to accomplish military tasks as well as any hereditary soldier from an older tradition. It was an optimism born from the nation's industrial confidence, from the assumption that with enough factories running at full capacity, with enough trucks and radios and ammunition, raw manpower could be made effective. The German philosophy held that you molded men into soldiers through years of disciplined repetition and the internalization of military culture. The American philosophy seemed to be that you gave men the right tools, the right information, and the right supplies, and they would figure out how to be soldiers well enough. Time would tell which assumption better survived contact with actual war. But in the spring of 1941, with America still technically at peace, and the first great conscript army being assembled in training camps across the nation, both visions seemed plausible. Both seemed possible. Neither army knew yet what they were truly capable of, or what costs they would pay to find out. If you were to walk into a Prussian barracks in the autumn of 1939, you would enter a world constructed almost entirely around the idea of unquestioned obedience, fused with a peculiar kind of thinking freedom. A German recruit, perhaps a boy of 19 or 20, would arrive at his unit, having been already sorted by a vast bureaucratic machinery. He had already been tested, measured, assessed, in ways both visible and invisible. The Wehrmacht had inherited from generations of Prussian drill masters an almost religious faith in hierarchy, and that faith began the moment a young man stepped across the threshold. His commanding officer was not merely a superior to be obeyed, but a figure whose judgment about tactics, about positioning, about the movement of men across terrain, was law itself. And yet, and this is the paradox that made German infantry so dangerous throughout the early war years, within that rigid framework of obedience lay something called Auftragstaktik, or mission-based tactics. What this meant in practice was that once an order was given by a senior officer, a subordinate was expected not to follow it rote and blind, but to understand its purpose, to grasp the objective, and then to execute that mission in whatever way made tactical sense, given what was happening on the actual ground around him. It was a strange dance, obedience and initiative held in the same hand. A squad leader might receive an order to move through a village and secure the eastern ridge, and rather than following a precise choreographed sequence, he was trusted, even expected, to adapt, to deviate, to find the best path forward given what he encountered. Think of how that shaped a young man's mind during those first weeks and months of training. He learned drill, yes, endless repetitive drill that smoothed the rough individual into a synchronized part of a larger organism. But he was also being trained to think, to understand not just the how, but the why of his duties. German basic training was brutal in its physicality, but intellectually demanding. A recruit spent months learning to read terrain, to understand fire and movement, to grasp how a machine gun established a base of fire and how riflemen moved in relation to that gun's protective cone. Across an ocean, in the sprawling training camps of America, something entirely different was unfolding. The United States Army in the late 1930s and early 1940s was a small peacetime force, and when mobilization finally came, it came like a sudden flood. Millions of young American men, draftees and volunteers alike, arrived at Camp Blanding, Camp Lejeune, Camp Hood, at bases with names that stretched across the country like a geography lesson. And they encountered a system built not on centuries of Prussian discipline, but on something more pragmatic, more democratic, and in some ways more mechanical. American basic training was standardized. There were manuals, official army publications that prescribed how every recruit should be trained, what every soldier should know, how every unit should function. These manuals were the expression of an American faith in systems, in the power of written procedure and consistent application. A recruit in Georgia trained the same way as a recruit in California. The philosophy was efficient, egalitarian in its own fashion, and it reflected something deeply American about how the nation approached large-scale organization. Where a German recruit might be shaped by a commanding officer's personal example and direct judgment, an American recruit was shaped by the manual, by the procedure, by an abstracted and standardized vision of what soldiering should be. Consider what this meant in practice. An American recruit's first weeks involved physical conditioning, yes, but also instruction in how to disassemble his rifle by the numbers, how to execute certain movements by the count. There was less emphasis on the why and more on the repeated correct execution of the how. Sergeants barked commands and expected compliance with a precision that was measured, timed, and documented. But the flavor was different from Prussian drill. There was less of the psychological weight of hierarchy, more of a sense of belonging to a large industrial operation where every man was a component to be properly configured. American training camps also had to absorb and train men at a rate that would have been incomprehensible to a German army still operating in a more traditional mode. Hundreds of thousands of young men, many with no military background, had to be transformed into soldiers in months rather than years. The system had to be fast, scalable, teachable. This created both efficiency and a kind of theoretical distance between the trainee and the full complexity of his role. He learned his job, learned it well, but not always why that job fit into the larger structure of warfare. There is something worth reflecting on about these two approaches and how they would eventually collide. The German recruit, shaped by the Prussian tradition and by Auftragstactik, arrived at his first combat experience with a framework for thinking independently within discipline. His unit cohesion was built on mutual understanding of purpose and a deep familiarity with his commanding officers and fellow soldiers. German units trained together for longer periods. There was continuity. But the American recruit, shaped by standardization and manual-driven procedure, arrived at combat with something different. He had been efficiently trained, equipped to know his specific task, and prepared to operate as part of a vast coordinated system. What he perhaps lacked initially was the deeper understanding of unit purpose that came from months of being shaped by the same commanding officer's personality and judgment. And yet, there was an American strength in this standardization that would become more apparent as the war unfolded. Because the American system, for all its seeming rigidity, could absorb losses and redistribute men across units and still maintain operational coherence. If casualties came, a replacement soldier trained to the same manual standards could be inserted into a unit and would, in theory, be able to function. German units, built on deeper personal bonds and on the assumption of long-term continuity of leadership, found themselves far more fragile when those bonds were broken, when the senior non-commissioned officers who embodied the unit's understanding of its purpose were killed. But in the beginning, in those first camps and drill fields of 1940 and 1941, neither side could have fully predicted how their different paths to building an infantryman would play out. What we can say is that they began from different histories, different trust in different systems, different faiths in how human beings learn to become soldiers. The German believed in the transformative power of a hierarchy, fully inhabited and understood. The American believed in the transformative power of correct procedure, applied universally. Both systems would prove capable of producing soldiers of great courage and skill. Both would also reveal their own particular vulnerabilities when exposed to the grinding chaos of modern warfare. There existed, in the German understanding of infantry warfare, a singular architectural principle that would define how 10 men moved together across a battlefield, how they lived together in the cold and mud, and ultimately how they died together. At the very center of this principle stood not a leader in the traditional sense, but rather a weapon, a machine gun that sang its own language of authority, and around this weapon all other men arranged themselves like satellites orbiting a sun that never set. The German squad, or Gruppe as it was known, was typically organized around 8 to 10 men, though this number fluctuated across the war's long span. But numbers alone tell us nothing of the philosophy that bound them. The MG-34, which served as the standard squad machine gun through the early years of the war, was not treated as merely one weapon among several. It was, in the German army's tactical imagination, the primary generator of firepower, the instrument around which all other efforts revolved. Two men served as gunner and loader, positions of considerable responsibility and skill, for operating the MG-34 required not simply pulling a trigger, but managing ammunition, anticipating fields of fire, and maintaining a rate of fire that could reach 600 rounds per minute when the conditions favored it. The remaining men in the squad functioned, in many respects, as support to this central engine. They were riflemen, each carrying the Kar 98K bolt-action rifle, that graceful, efficient weapon that could deliver accurate fire but at a rate far slower than the machine gun's relentless chatter. The rifleman's role was not to provide primary firepower, but rather to protect the machine gun position, to carry ammunition for it, to move with it, to ensure that if the enemy attempted to rush the gun's position, rifle fire would drive them back. In this sense, the entire squad structure embodied a kind of hierarchy of function, a recognition that the sustained fire of the machine gun was the foundation upon which all other tactics rested. Consider how this shaped the psychology of the squad. The knowledge that each man's survival depended partly on the machine gun's ability to suppress enemy movement, and that the machine gun's effectiveness depended on each rifleman's willingness to protect it. Later in the war, as the MG-34 proved somewhat vulnerable to damage and occasional jamming in the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front, the Germans introduced the MG-42, a weapon that would become legendary in its reputation. The MG-42 was, in many respects, a distillation and perfection of the machine gun philosophy, simpler to manufacture, more reliable, and capable of an even more astonishing rate of fire, reaching nearly 1,300 rounds per minute. This weapon, with its distinctive high-pitched buzz that German soldiers themselves came to recognize as the voice of their own superiority, became perhaps the most feared gun of the entire war. To hear it was to understand, in an almost cellular way, that the position holding it possessed an enormous concentration of firepower, and that the landscape around it had become fundamentally dangerous to cross. The squad leader, typically a sergeant or Oberschütze, occupied a delicate position in this structure. He was not simply the voice of authority in the traditional hierarchical sense, though authority was certainly part of his function. Rather, he was the mind that coordinated the machine gun's placement with the movement of the riflemen, who decided where the squad would go and how it would employ its firepower. Yet even the squad leader's authority was understood within the context of the machine gun's primacy. Decisions about position, movement, and engagement were fundamentally constrained by where the gun could be placed, how it could be supplied with ammunition, and what fields of fire it could command. This created a kind of tactical grammar that was deeply different from what other armies might conceive. The ammunition bearers, of which there were typically at least 2 or 3 per squad, carried not only the machine gun's ammunition, but also their own sense of purpose, derived from this proximity to the weapon's needs. They understood themselves as essential to the entire enterprise. No ammunition, no machine gun, no squad. This awareness created a particular form of cohesion, a tangible interdependence that was perhaps easier to understand than more abstract notions of brotherhood or national duty. When you know that your survival and the survival of your comrades depends on your ability to keep a particular weapon supplied and functioning, the bonds that form are immediate and practical. The riflemen, for their part, developed a different psychology entirely. They were numerous. Their individual contribution to firepower was modest, yet they understood themselves as essential to protecting the position that truly mattered. There was perhaps a certain resignation in this role, a recognition that one's rifle, however well maintained and accurate, was fundamentally secondary in the machinery of squad-level combat. Yet there was also a kind of security in this arrangement, for if the machine gun was being served well, and positioned wisely, the squad had a reasonable chance of surviving an engagement that might otherwise be overwhelming. The psychological weight of German squad combat thus distributed itself in a particular way. The machine gun team carried the burden of maintaining fire discipline and managing the weapon's functions, while the riflemen carried the burden of vigilance and the willingness to move into danger when called upon. This structural arrangement also shaped how the German squad understood terrain. The squad did not move as a unified cluster, but rather as a coordinated organism whose shape and spacing were determined by where the machine gun could best be positioned and how the riflemen could best support it. When the squad moved through a village or across open ground, they were not simply moving from point to point, but rather seeking positions where the machine gun could dominate the surrounding space. Each building, each hedge, each fold of ground was evaluated not in isolation, but for its potential utility as a machine gun position. This constant mental mapping of the landscape according to firepower requirements created in the German infantryman a particular way of seeing terrain, one that was fundamentally shaped by the machine gun's presence. The relationship between the squad leader and the machine gun team was, perhaps, the most delicate and crucial within the entire formation. For the squad leader to lead effectively, he needed to understand the machine gun's capabilities and limitations intimately. He needed to know how far its fire could reach, how quickly it could shift targets, how vulnerable it was during these shifts. A poor decision about machine gun placement could cost the entire squad its position and, quite possibly, its lives. A wise decision about placement could mean that a squad of 10 men could hold off an attacking force many times its size, at least for a time. This created a constant dialogue between the squad leader and the gun team, a mutual respect based on the recognition that each depended on the other's competence. By contrast to what would emerge in the American squad structure, the German approach represented a mature, carefully thought-through philosophy developed through centuries of Prussian and then German military tradition. It was not hasty or improvised, but rather reflected a deep commitment to the idea that infantry combat was fundamentally a matter of firepower coordination, that the machine gun was the weapon of the future, and that all other elements of the squad should be arranged to maximize the gun's effectiveness. Whether this philosophy ultimately proved superior to other approaches would depend on many factors: terrain, enemy tactics, supply lines, the morale and training of individual soldiers. But in its own logic and coherence, it was formidable, a complete and integrated system for organizing the violent energy of a small group of men into a disciplined expression of military force. Across the Atlantic, the American infantry entered World War II with a fundamentally different problem to solve. Where the German army had spent decades refining the art of concentrating fire through a single platform, the machine gun, the Americans faced the opposite question: how do you organize men for combat when you don't have that central pillar of firepower to anchor your thinking? The answer would emerge not from military theorists in quiet rooms, but from industrial capacity, democratic instinct, and a peculiar American faith in the individual soldier's capability. The basic American infantry squad that would fight across North Africa, through Sicily, into Normandy, and across the Rhine was built around a rifle, specifically the semi-automatic M1 Garand. This was not a revolutionary weapon in isolation. The Germans and Soviets both had semi-automatic rifles in development or service, but the Americans did something the others could not or would not. They made sure nearly every rifleman carried one. Not most riflemen, nearly everyone. This meant that where a German squad concentrated its firepower into the hands of 2 men operating a machine gun, an American squad dispersed that same theoretical firepower across 8 or 9 men, each capable of delivering accurate, sustained fire without waiting for orders from above. Consider the arithmetic of it. A German MG-34 could fire roughly 800 rounds per minute, but it required ammunition carriers, a gunner, an assistant, and precise positioning. Its strength was overwhelming suppression in a fixed line. Its weakness, perhaps, was that it demanded the squad move around it, think around it, build every tactic on its presence. When the gun jammed, and all guns jam, the squad's firepower did not merely diminish, it evaporated. The M1 Garand, by contrast, fired 30 rounds per minute in trained hands, semi-automatic fire that was nowhere near as fast as full automatic, nowhere near as punishing as a machine gun's wall of bullets, yet something quite different in nature. It was democratized firepower. 8 men each firing 8 rounds per minute was not the same as one gun firing 800, but 8 men thinking independently, moving independently, each able to engage targets at ranges up to 300 yards. This created a texture of combat that was fundamentally less hierarchical, less dependent on precise coordination, more forgiving of improvisation. The American squad structure reflected this different philosophy. It consisted typically of a squad leader, a corporal or sergeant, who carried a rifle of his own. Then came the riflemen, usually 7 or 8 of them, each with an M1. Some sources mention a Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, which could sustain semi-automatic or fully automatic fire, but its role in the squad was often less central than the German MG's role. It was support, emphasis, rather than foundation. What this meant in practical terms was that an American squad could be scattered across a wider area than a German squad, could move more independently, could lose a man or two without losing its tactical identity, the way losing a machine gun crew meant losing the squad's spine. There is something profoundly American about this approach, though perhaps not in ways Americans always recognized at the time. It assumes that the individual soldier is capable, that he can be trusted with sustained firepower, that he can make targeting decisions, that he does not need constant supervision. It trusts literacy and training over inherited hierarchy. It assumes, perhaps optimistically, that a man with a rifle and ammunition can think for himself. The Germans built their squad around the assumption that an elite few would control the squad's striking power and everyone else would support that control. The Americans built theirs on the assumption that many men could be capable. In the forest of doctrine and metal, this distinction mattered profoundly. An American squad leader, often young himself, sometimes barely literate, could give simpler orders. You move left, you move right, lay down fire. The men didn't need to await detailed instructions about suppressive arcs or overlapping fields of fire. They carried the fire itself. This was less elegant than the German system, perhaps. It required more ammunition, more supply lines, more logistics. But it was resilient. It was democratic in a quiet, material way. It rewarded initiative. It meant that even a mediocre leader could function because his men brought their own power to the engagement. The Garand rifle itself became almost a symbol of this philosophy. Adopted in 1936, it was the first semi-automatic rifle issued to an entire army at the start of a major war. It had a distinctive ping when its 8-round clip ejected after firing, a sound that would become iconic in accounts of American combat. A trained rifleman could fire it accurately at 300 yards. He could reload relatively quickly, and there were thousands upon thousands of them, manufactured by Springfield Armory and Winchester in a peacetime economy that soon became a war economy, producing rifles as if they were automobiles, which, in the industrial logic of the time, they almost were. What did this mean for the soldier himself, the man holding the rifle? It meant that he was not an accessory to the firepower, he was the firepower. He could not blame the system or the squad structure if he failed to engage a target. He was responsible. This cut both ways, of course. It could be empowering or terrifying, depending on the man and the moment. But it was fundamentally different from the experience of being a rifleman in a German squad, where your role was partly to protect the machine gun, to carry ammunition for it, to move in relation to it. In the American system, you were the primary weapon. The squad might include a sergeant, a couple of corporals for team leaders, but the hierarchy was flatter, less absolute. Orders came down, yes, but they were often about direction and intent rather than precise micromanagement. Take that position, pin down the enemy. The German system would say, the gun will be here, you will be here, you will move when the gun moves. American leadership, developed over long years of small peacetime armies and militia traditions, was more comfortable with ambiguity, with sergeants who were not aristocrats, with orders that left room for interpretation. And yet, and this is a gentle observation worth sitting with for a moment, this system also demanded far more ammunition. 8 men firing 8 rounds per minute, at 30 rounds per minute individually, creates a different logistics problem entirely than concentrating firepower in one gun. This is not a flaw, it is merely the price of the American choice. It meant an industrial machine that could produce not just rifles but the rivers of ammunition to feed them. It meant supply chains stretching across oceans. It meant trucks and ships and factories running night and day. The German system could, theoretically, operate on less ammunition if the machine gunners were precise, disciplined, conserving their fire. The American system assumed abundance, assumed that you would pour ammunition downrange, assumed that volume would somehow compensate for less focused firepower. This assumption of abundance would prove crucial later, particularly in the open movements of Germany in 1945, where American logistics could sustain rapid advances in ways the German army, increasingly strangled, could not. But that reckoning lay ahead. For now, as the American infantry divisions trained, they trained around this singular platform, the Garand, the squad, the philosophy of dispersed individual firepower. It was a choice born not from military genius, but from American industrial confidence and the democratic instinct to arm the many rather than to concentrate power in the few. What that choice would mean when these two armies finally collided in the hedgerows and forests of Europe would take years to fully unfold. And so we arrive at something quieter, perhaps harder to see than any uniform or weapon itself, the underlying philosophy that made these two armies think so differently about how violence should be applied on the ground. Because when you study the German squad, with its single machine gun as the gravitational center, and then look across at the American squad, where every man carried a semi-automatic rifle capable of sustained fire, you are not simply observing a difference in equipment. You are watching two nations argue, without words, about what war should be. The German choice to build the squad around the machine gun came from decades of observation, from the trenches of the First World War, where sustained suppressive fire had proven itself again and again to be the architect of survival. Think of it this way: if you can pin an enemy down under an umbrella of bullets, you have bought your own soldiers time and space to move. The machine gun became, in the German mind, not simply a weapon but the spine of an organism. The riflemen, and there were more of them than the gun crews, make no mistake, existed in relation to that spine. They supported it, protected it, carried ammunition for it, and when the moment came, they would advance once the gun had opened its terrible mouth and made the opposite position untenable. This created a kind of dependency, a need for perfect coordination and timing. You could not have hesitation. You could not have individuals deciding to do their own thing. The machine gun's fire had to be answered by movement from the rifle section, and that movement had to happen when the suppression was actually happening, not a moment before or after. It demanded what we might call a collective consciousness on the battlefield, a squad that thought as one organism, that trusted implicitly in the gun team's ability to keep them alive while they moved, and that understood their role not as individual shooters, but as components of a single tactic. The Americans, by contrast, had made a fundamentally different bet. Every soldier with an M1 Garand was, in theory, a source of sustained firepower. That rifle could be operated semi-automatically by a man with training and nerve. You could put 15 rounds downrange in a short time from a single rifleman if he kept his head. And if you had 12 men in a squad, and each could deliver that kind of volume, you had something that looked, on paper at least, like overwhelming distributed firepower. There was no single point of failure, no dependency on one gun team staying alive and in position. Every man was, in a sense, his own source of suppression. This spoke to something deeper in American military thinking, a faith in individual competence, in the idea that you could train a citizen soldier to be both reliable and independent, and that when you multiplied that reliability across a unit, you did not need rigid hierarchy or perfect synchronization the way the Germans believed you did. The American philosophy, if we can call it that, was almost optimistic. It said, give a good man a good rifle, teach him to shoot, teach him to think a little, and then trust him to know when to move and when to fire. The German philosophy was harder, almost pessimistic in its wisdom. It said, do not trust individuals under fire, trust structure, trust discipline, trust the machine gun and the men who crew it to create the conditions under which ordinary soldiers can do extraordinary things. And what emerged from these competing philosophies on an actual battlefield was something that might surprise you, depending on what you have read. The German system was, in many ways, more efficient with ammunition and firepower, more economical of effort. It wasted less in volume and achieved more with concentration. When a German squad attacked, it did so with a kind of choreography. The machine gun opened fire. The rhythm of its bullets formed an almost visible line across the landscape, and then, in response to that suppression, the riflemen would bound forward, using small unit tactics that had been drilled into them hundreds of times. It was devastating when it worked, when the machine gun stayed in action, when the ammunition held out, when the squad understood its own timing. It was nearly unstoppable. But the American system had a different kind of strength. It was more flexible. It was harder to break because it did not depend on any single element remaining active. If an American squad came under fire and the machine gun team, say, had to take cover or was suppressed, the riflemen could still respond with their own individual fire. The squad could spread out across more ground. It could adapt more quickly to unexpected terrain or enemy positions because every man had some capacity to contribute firepower rather than waiting for permission or positioning from a gun team. It was less coordinated perhaps, but more resilient. Some military historians suggest that the American approach was also easier for rapid training and mass mobilization. You could teach a man to fire a Garand in weeks. The principles were straightforward. The gun was mechanical and reliable. By contrast, training an effective machine gun team required more time, more specialized knowledge, and more of the kind of veterans who understood how to keep the gun in action under stress. As America went to war, churning out hundreds of thousands of soldiers in short order, the Garand-centered squad made practical sense. You needed fewer specialists. You needed faster throughput. The Germans, starting with a smaller, more professional army, could afford, or rather required, the longer training and specialization. What this meant in the hedgerows and forests where these armies would eventually meet was not always what the doctrine suggested. The German philosophy of suppression and coordinated movement worked beautifully in open terrain, in situations where you could actually maintain that line of machine gun fire and have space for your riflemen to maneuver. But in thick forest, in broken ground, in towns where buildings provided cover and angles became chaotic, that tight coordination began to unravel. The space became too cluttered for the carefully timed dance of suppression and advance. The American method, meanwhile, required a kind of confidence and individual initiative that not every hastily trained GI possessed. But when it worked, when American squads learned to use their firepower in volume, to push forward through their own defensive fire, to adapt quickly when things went sideways, it had a kind of rough, overwhelming force that German defenders found terribly difficult to stop. Neither philosophy was simply right or wrong. They were both responses to different experiences, different resources, and different beliefs about what soldiers could be asked to do. The German system was born from the industrial slaughter of the First World War and the hard discipline that had been passed down through the Reichswehr years. It was the philosophy of men who believed that war was fundamentally chaos, and that the only answer to chaos was perfect order. The American system was born from a tradition of civilian military service, from the belief that an educated, motivated citizen soldier could improvise and adapt, that trust in the individual could create more flexibility than any amount of rigid planning. These two philosophies would collide directly in the months ahead, and on the cold ground of Normandy and beyond, both would be tested against an enemy that thought in neither language but understood, in the deepest way, the cost of being wrong. The fields of Poland in September 1939 lay beneath a grey sky, and across them moved something the world had not quite seen before. The German infantry did not march in the old patterns, not shoulder to shoulder in dense formations that previous wars had demanded. Instead, they moved in loose clusters, in small groups that seemed almost to drift across the landscape, like fog breaking apart and reforming. This was the essence of the Blitzkrieg infantry, or Blitzkampftruppe as some called it, lightning war troops, and they operated according to principles that had been carefully refined in military academies and tested in the Spanish Civil War just a few years before. The fundamental shift was this: German infantry no longer waited for orders to trickle down from a distant command post. Officers and non-commissioned officers, these Feldwebels and Unteroffiziers, were trained to understand the broader intent of their mission, to see the shape of the battle as it unfolded around them, and to act within that general direction without waiting for explicit instruction at every moment. This was called Auftragstaktik, or mission tactics, and it represented a kind of trust between commanders and the men beneath them, a trust that asked soldiers to think, to adapt, to push forward even when the radio had gone silent and the captain's voice could no longer be heard over the sound of engines and gunfire. Picture, then, a German platoon moving through the Polish countryside in those early autumn weeks. They would not advance in a line, cautiously feeling out the enemy position. Instead, they would probe, they would test, they would press forward rapidly, looking for the weakness, the gap in the line where they might pour through. One group might fix the enemy in place with heavy machine gun fire, while another group worked around the flank, or perhaps dashed forward in short rushes, using what little cover the landscape offered. The rhythm was urgent, the tempo fast, and the intention was always to maintain momentum, never to let the enemy have time to reorganize or call for reinforcements. And yet, and this is a detail easy to overlook, the German infantry in this period was not actually moving at superhuman speed. The Blitzkrieg was not about the individual soldier running faster or fighting harder. It was about coordination, timing, and the precise orchestration of different arms working together. When a German infantry unit encountered resistance, it did not simply charge. Instead, it would bring fire to bear immediately, machine guns and rifles suppressing the enemy position while elements worked around the flanks. This required training, yes, but more importantly, it required a shared understanding among the men of what was expected, of what the rhythms of maneuver looked like. The arrival of armor changed everything about how this infiltration worked. The panzer units that moved alongside the infantry, tanks like the PZKPFW 3 and 4, though initially small and lightly armored by later standards, these vehicles were not separate from the infantry operation. They were woven into it. When infantry encountered a strong point, a machine gun nest in a farmhouse, or a fortified position along a stream, the tanks would move forward to provide direct fire support, their guns hammering at the position, while the infantry used the suppression to work around the flank, or even to assault directly. The speed and violence of this combined arms approach was something the Polish army, equipped and trained for an earlier kind of warfare, found nearly impossible to counter. In the French campaign in May and June of 1940, this tactical approach reached perhaps its fullest expression. German infantry units moved through the Belgian forests in ways that suggested an almost eerie precision. Small groups would bypass strongpoints entirely, leaving them for follow-up units to deal with. The objective was not to fight every battle, but to create confusion, to move so quickly that the enemy's command structure could not keep pace with what was actually happening on the ground. By the time a French general had realized that his line had been broken, German columns were already miles behind what had been his front line, cutting roads, seizing bridges, moving toward the Channel. The mechanics of this infiltration relied heavily on something quite simple but elegant: the ability of German squad and platoon leaders to navigate by compass and map, to understand contour lines and how terrain moved, to recognize when they had achieved their objective and when it was time to press deeper. There was a kind of spatial intelligence being asked of men who, just a few years earlier, had been civilians going about ordinary lives. Yet the training had provided them with mental frameworks for seeing the landscape not as a place, but as a tactical problem to be solved. Could the squad move through those woods without being observed? Where would the enemy positions likely be? How quickly could an objective be seized before reserves could be brought to bear? The coordination with armor, though, was sometimes fragmentary and informal. It is perhaps tempting to imagine that German panzer and infantry units operated with perfect synchronization, each knowing the other's position and intention at all times. The reality was somewhat messier. Radio communication was primitive by later standards. Commanders coordinated face-to-face when possible, or through runners, or through signals and observation. Sometimes the tanks moved too far ahead of the infantry, and sometimes the infantry had to pause and wait for armor to catch up. What gave the appearance of smooth coordination was often the result of aggression and flexibility. When things went wrong, the units adapted and pushed forward anyway, seeking to maintain the momentum that was the true secret of blitzkrieg success. One must resist, gently, the temptation to view blitzkrieg as mysterious or revolutionary in some mystical sense. It was, in essence, a very practical application of combined arms tactics using the technologies available in 1939 and 1940. It relied on good training, on a doctrinal understanding that emphasized decentralized command and initiative at lower levels, and on the fact that the armies facing Germany were still operating according to earlier assumptions about how war would be fought. It was innovative, certainly, but it was also, in a way that would only become apparent later, quite vulnerable to defenders who understood the tactics and had the tools to counter them. The infiltration patterns that German units employed were designed for open or semi-open terrain, for situations where the enemy had not had time to prepare deep defensive positions. They worked brilliantly in Poland, where surprise was nearly total and the Polish army was still deploying its forces along the frontier. They worked in France, where the Maginot Line's static defences could be bypassed entirely by moving through Belgium and the Low Countries. But these same tactics would face serious challenges once the fighting shifted to Russia, where the vast distances actually favoured the defensive, and where the enemy would eventually have unlimited time to prepare and construct deeply layered defensive positions. For now, though, In 1939 and 1940, the German infantry had found a way of fighting that seemed almost unstoppable, a way that married doctrine and technology and human will into something that shattered the older armies it encountered. While the Wehrmacht infantry had spent years refining their craft through campaigns across Europe, the American soldier was arriving in North Africa for an education that would come at an extraordinarily steep price. In the autumn of 1942, when American forces first landed in Morocco and Algeria, they carried with them all the confidence of an industrial nation preparing for war, but almost none of the hard experience that experience alone can teach. The men disembarking from their transports were volunteers and draftees who had trained in camps across the United States for perhaps 6 months, who had fired their M1 Garans on ranges, who understood the manual of arms and the chain of command. What they did not understand was what happened when a mortar round landed 3 yards from where you stood, or how fear changes the way your hands move when you're loading a magazine under fire. The first real test came at a place called Gafsa, in Tunisia, early in 1943. American infantry units met German and Italian defenders in what seemed like a straightforward engagement, but the German response revealed how thoroughly unprepared the Americans were for coordinated defensive tactics. German infantry did not simply hold a line and wait to be overrun. Instead, they used the terrain with an intuitive efficiency that had been drilled into them across years of training. When American forces advanced, they walked into carefully prepared fields of fire, where German machine gunners, supported by riflemen and anti-tank guns, created what amounted to invisible walls of fire. The Americans, trained to advance and fight aggressively, discovered that aggression alone could not overcome discipline and planning. The casualty rates in those early engagements were shocking, not because the Americans were cowardly or poorly motivated, but because they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern combined arms warfare. What strikes one so deeply when reading the accounts of these early defeats is the almost broken quality of the written records from American commanders. They speak of confusion, of units becoming separated, of not understanding how to coordinate infantry with supporting fire. German officers, by contrast, seem to operate from a kind of inherited playbook. They know how to position machine guns to cover likely approaches. They know how to establish overlapping fields of fire. They know how to move small groups of men under suppression, while others provide covering fire. These were not individual insights, but the accumulated doctrine of an army that had fought in the trenches of the First World War, had reorganized itself afterward, and had spent the 1930s refining every detail of how infantry units should operate as coordinated wholes. The American High Command understood quickly that they had a serious problem. More importantly, they began to solve it in a way that was distinctly American. Rather than wait for decades of institutional learning, they established schools. Officers and sergeants who had survived combat were rotated back to teach in rear areas. Unit commanders began to study German tactics methodically, in the same way they might study an engineering problem, because many of them were engineers, or had been trained as such. Manuals were rewritten, training was restructured. Within weeks and months, something began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first. American units began to practice the same kind of coordinated fire and movement that German troops performed almost instinctively. The difference was that American soldiers were learning it consciously, intellectually, rather than absorbing it through years of repetition. The learning curve in North Africa was steep, and it was paid for in American lives. At Sidi Bou Zid, at Kasserine Pass, at Gafsa again, American units took losses that seemed disproportionate to what little ground was gained or lost. But something crucial was happening underneath those statistics. Young platoon sergeants were discovering how to use terrain. Company officers were learning when to advance and when to wait for supporting fire. Men who had never heard a shot fired in anger were becoming combat veterans, and their knowledge, imperfect and hard-won though it was, began to spread through the American army like water seeping through soil. A sergeant who had survived an ambush would brief his platoon on what he'd learned. A lieutenant who had seen his men cut down by machine gun fire would reorganize his squad tactics accordingly. One can imagine, even now, the slow transformation of the American soldier during those months in North Africa. He was no longer the recruit fresh from camp, no longer the young man who believed that courage and determination were sufficient to overcome any enemy position. Instead, he was becoming something harder to define, but far more effective. A soldier who understood that warfare was a problem to be solved, that there were techniques and methods that worked, and methods that resulted in death. The German soldier, by this point, had been solving these problems for years, but the American soldier, given time and given the right instruction, could learn them too, and once learned, they could be taught to others. This was perhaps the single greatest advantage the Americans possessed. Though they did not understand it yet, they could absorb lessons, systematize them, and distribute that knowledge throughout an entire army with a speed that no other nation could match. By the time the American infantry began operations in Sicily and then crossed into southern Italy, the transformation was visible. Officers and men operated with a coordination that suggested long practice rather than months of learning under fire. Machine gun teams understood their role in supporting advancing riflemen. Squad leaders knew how to use small unit tactics to suppress enemy fire while sending men to flank a position. It was not yet the kind of automatic, intuitive expertise that German infantry possessed, but it was far closer. And crucially, American soldiers had begun to understand that the German infantry, while experienced and well-trained, was not invincible. They could be surprised, they could be outmaneuvered, they could be beaten if American units worked together with the kind of coordination that had once seemed impossibly complex. What the American army was learning in North Africa was that modern warfare required more than just individual soldiers willing to fight. It required systems of communication, of supply, of rotating and resting troops, of ensuring that lessons learned by one unit were shared with all others. The Germans had these systems too, of course, but they had developed them over a much longer period, through experience and in many cases through tragic failure. The Americans, with their industrial mindset and their willingness to treat warfare as a problem requiring systematic solutions, were learning to build comparable systems in a fraction of the time. And once they had built those systems, the war would begin to look very different. The infantry units that would land at Normandy would not be the inexperienced soldiers who had stumbled through Tunisia and North Africa. They would be seasoned soldiers operating within a machine that was learning, rapidly and efficiently, how to apply force with devastating effect. To understand what it meant to be a German soldier on the Eastern Front is to glimpse something that the Western theaters of this war, with all their hardship, could never quite capture: a grinding, almost biblical vastness of suffering that wore away at men layer by layer, like soil eroded by relentless water. The Eastern Front, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, became something more than a battlefield. It became a kind of anteroom to a different world entirely, one where the ordinary calculus of survival seemed to break down entirely. Picture, if you can, the moment a German infantryman, a Lancer, as they called themselves, a word that meant simply soldier of the land, received his orders for posting east in late 1941 or early 1942. The letters written home in those months carry a peculiar tone, a kind of voice caught between confidence and a dawning, unspoken dread. The blitzkrieg had worked. Poland, France, the Balkans, all had fallen in weeks or months. But Russia was different. Russia was vast in a way that German soldiers had not been trained to understand, and by the time they realized this, they were already deep inside it, and winter was coming. The cold itself becomes almost a character in the story of the Eastern Front. This was not the winter of the German homeland, with its snow and wind, but also its warm kitchens and hot stoves. This was a Russian winter, the kind that had already broken Napoleon's Grande Armée more than a century before. German soldiers in late 1941 were still equipped with summer uniforms. The High Command had believed, or perhaps hoped, that the war in the East would be finished before autumn turned to December. By November, men were wrapping newspaper around their bodies under their tunics for insulation. By December, they were tearing apart abandoned buildings for wood, burning anything that would burn, huddling together in frozen dugouts that filled with ice water from the ground beneath them. Fingers froze black, toes turned gangrenous. Men fell asleep in the snow and never woke. This was not combat killing them alone. It was the patient, indifferent machinery of nature itself. The scarcity of everything became, over time, more deadening than the cold itself. German logistics, that carefully engineered system that had worked so well in Poland and France, stretched and then shattered across the vastness of Soviet territory. Supply lines that ran for hundreds of kilometers were vulnerable, interrupted by partisan attacks, slowed by mud in spring and autumn that turned roads into rivers. By 1943 and 1944, a German soldier on the Eastern Front could expect rations that had been reduced again and again, bread that was thin and dark, thin soup, sometimes horse meat, sometimes not even that. A man could consume perhaps 1,500 calories a day when he needed 3,000 just to maintain body temperature in those conditions. How does a soldier fight with his strength slowly leaking away, hour by hour, day by day? How does he fight when his mind, starved of fuel, begins to move in a slower, more distant way? And yet the machinery of the army continued. Orders came. The front line had to be held. Here is where we encounter one of the most complex aspects of the German soldier's experience on the East, the strange endurance of discipline, the way that training and hierarchy, and the simple habit of obedience could keep men moving even as their bodies and minds fell into a state that contemporary observers struggled to describe. A German officer or NCO on the Eastern Front was managing not just combat, but the constant threat of dissolution. Men had to be kept moving. They had to be kept believing that survival was possible, that the war could still be won, that their sacrifice meant something. The methods varied. Some leaders led by example and earned a kind of love from their men. Others relied on severity, on the threat of court-martial or execution for desertion or failure. Both approaches worked, after a fashion, and often the same man employed both in the same week. The trenches and dugouts of the Eastern Front looked very different from the static lines of World War I, or even from the more elaborate German fortifications on the Western Front. In the East, the fighting often moved. Ground was gained and lost. Entire divisions would sometimes be surrounded and annihilated. But in the quieter sectors, in the long stretches of winter when both sides had exhausted themselves into a kind of frozen stalemate, the front lines became an almost medieval landscape of half-buried bunkers, frozen wire, and no man's land that stretched, in some places, only a few hundred meters. A German soldier might spend weeks in these positions, rotating between the front dugout and the reserve positions 100 meters back. The dugouts themselves were terrible, half-flooded, never entirely dry, built with minimal materials because wood and labor were both scarce. What happened to the mind of a man in such conditions? The letters and memoirs that survived the war suggest a profound psychological toll that went beyond the normal exhaustion of combat. There was something about the endlessness of the Eastern Front that broke men in particular ways. In the West, soldiers could sometimes believe that if they survived this battle, if they held this position, the war might move elsewhere. But on the Eastern Front, the distance was so vast that every victory seemed to change nothing. The Red Army replaced its losses with men from the seemingly inexhaustible depths of Soviet population. German losses were replaced more slowly, and the replacements were often younger, less trained, less able to survive the conditions. A veteran of the Eastern Front, after 3 years, had seen such things, such loss, such futility, such casual horror, that the mind sometimes seemed to retreat into a kind of numbness that was possibly the only thing that could keep a man alive. Consider the matter of rotation. American soldiers, and to some extent British soldiers, had rotation policies. After a certain number of campaigns, or a certain amount of time in combat, a soldier could expect to be rotated home, or at least to a rear area. This gave men something to hold on to, a mathematical endpoint, a way to count down toward survival. The German army had no such policy for most of the war. A soldier was his unit until the war ended, or until he was killed, disabled, or captured. What does this do to a man's sense of time? What happens when you cannot construct a narrative in which you survive? The relationships between soldiers became both more intense and more fragile in these circumstances. Comradeship, the bond between men in a small unit facing mutual danger, was often described by German veterans as the only thing that kept them going. The trust in the men beside them, the unwillingness to let them down, the sense that their own death might somehow protect the others from having to endure what they were enduring. But these bonds were constantly being shattered. Men died, whole units were destroyed, replacements arrived, often young and unprepared, and the veterans had to invest emotional energy in teaching them just enough to keep them alive a few more months. It was a form of slow grief, year after year. By 1944 and 1945, the German soldiers on the Eastern Front, the few who had survived that long, had been fundamentally changed by their experience. Some had become almost automatic in their behavior, responding to stimulus and command without apparent consciousness. Some had become hardened in ways that suggested a kind of moral erosion, becoming capable of things that would have horrified them before. Some had maintained a kind of inner distance, a compartmentalization of the self that allowed them to function while preserving something human underneath. And some had simply broken, finding themselves unable to continue, unable to kill anymore, unable to remain present in their own lives. The physical appearance of these men, by the war's final year, was often striking, gaunt, aged beyond their years, with eyes that seemed to reflect something very distant or very absent. Photographs of German soldiers in 1945 often show men who look 20 years older than their actual age. The Eastern Front had consumed them in a way that was almost alchemical, transforming living men into something else entirely. Yet they continued. Somehow, improbably, without hope and often without sufficient supplies, without rotation or reprieve, German soldiers on the Eastern Front continued to fight. They held positions, they conducted retreats, they endured. Not all of them, certainly. Desertion increased as the war went on, and some men found ways to remove themselves from combat through injury or illness. But the majority continued, driven by discipline, by fear of what would happen to them if they stopped, by the inertia of the machine they were part of, and sometimes by something that might almost be called dignity, a determination to maintain some standard of soldierly behavior, even in the face of absolute degradation. This was the daily reality of a German soldier on the Eastern Front, a reality so far removed from the experience of an American soldier that they might almost have been fighting different wars entirely. The American infantrymen, preparing for war in 1943 and 1944, inhabited a world of paradox that would have seemed almost surreal to his German counterpart. Vast training camps sprawled across the American countryside: Fort Benning, Camp Lejeune, Fort Bragg, Small cities of olive-drab tents and wooden barracks where hundreds of thousands of citizen soldiers learned the grammar of combat in an almost classically American way, which is to say, with an abundance of resources that bordered on the conspicuous. These camps were well lit. They had mess halls that, by any reasonable standard, served adequate and sometimes generous food. The infrastructure itself spoke of industrial confidence, of a nation that believed it could manufacture not only weapons but also warriors, and that it could do so at scale. The American recruits' day began with reveille sounded by bugle or loudspeaker, the sky still dark in many seasons, and then the slow assembly for physical training that was designed less to forge an aristocratic officer corps than to take the softness out of millions of young men pulled from farms, factories, and city streets. Unlike the German system, which carried forward Prussian assumptions about hierarchy and unquestioning obedience flowing downward like water seeking its level, the American military philosophy, at least in its stated ideals, held that the citizen soldier could be persuaded, could be reasoned with, could understand the why behind orders even when the immediate pressure was to simply obey. Whether this was always practiced is another question entirely, but the assumption lived in the training manuals and in the thinking of many senior officers who had themselves come up through a peacetime army and believed in a certain minimum dignity of the individual soldier. Training was exhausting, unquestionably. 20-mile forced marches with full packs, obstacle courses, rifle ranges where thousands of young men fired millions of rounds in a great steady rhythm, the crack and smell of cordite becoming as familiar as breathing. But between these exertions, the American recruit enjoyed something that would have seemed almost miraculous to a young German Lanzer: relative comfort, hot showers, clean water that wasn't rationed or drawn from contaminated sources, cigarettes issued as part of the ration, chocolate. The PX, or post-exchange, where for a few cents a soldier could buy candy, razors, writing paper, magazines. The supply lines feeding American bases were themselves a kind of logistics triumph, though no one quite thought of it that way at the time. It was simply expected that there would be enough. The mess tents offered bread, sometimes biscuits that varied in quality but were present, canned meat, powdered eggs that, when properly prepared, were not entirely unpalatable, coffee, endless coffee, served in cups that could be refilled without limit. Compare this to the correspondence from German recruits of the same period, especially those shipping out to the Eastern Front, where the letters speak of hunger even in the training phase, of meal rations that seemed to shrink with each passing month, of the gnawing awareness that the apparatus that supplied the Wehrmacht was already showing signs of strain by 1943. The American soldier could not have articulated this comparison naturally. He knew only his own experience, but his body knew abundance in a way that would shape his entire war. The training camps also functioned as social worlds, or at least as spaces where social worlds were being constructed on the fly. Young men from Chicago billeted alongside boys from North Carolina, farmers next to factory workers, men who had never left their home county suddenly learning to read maps and follow orders from sergeants and officers drawn from the professional military, but also, increasingly, from the ranks of citizen volunteers. There was a kind of democratic ethos to it, or at least the pretense of one. The officer who ordered you to dig a ditch in the mud was also, in some sense, a civilian conscript, someone whose authority came from appointment rather than birth. This created a curious friction, a constant renegotiation of hierarchy that would manifest in various ways once these men reached combat zones. The barracks themselves became societies in miniature. Bunkmates shared cigarettes and letters from home. Small economies emerged. Someone always had a way to acquire extra food or spirits. Poker games ran through the nights in shadowed corners. Men wrote letters to girlfriends and mothers, and these letters, as they accumulated in the mail service, became a kind of national conversation, a vast archive of homesickness and bewilderment, and slowly solidifying camaraderie. The mail delivery itself was treated with an almost ceremonial importance. When the sergeant called out names and letters arrived from the civilian world, the tent went quiet and still, each man lost in the presence of his distant life. The training doctrine itself reflected American assumptions about warfare. The manuals emphasized the rifleman as the foundation, the semi-automatic M1 Garand, making every man a potential generator of sustained firepower rather than a support player in a machine gun-centric vision. The squad was taught to think in terms of forward movement, of crossing open ground, of assault. This made sense in theory, in the context of America's industrial advantage and the assumption that a well-armed, well-supplied force could move forward with sufficient momentum. But it was also an assumption untested by the grinding attrition of European combat. The recruits learning these tactics in 1943 and 1944 did not know yet how the hedgerows would constrain their movement, or how German defensive discipline would exact a terrible price for forward momentum. When the time came to move toward embarkation, the camps began to empty. The men were issued new uniforms, sometimes multiple sets. Immunizations and inoculations were administered in mass clinics. There were inspections, endless inspections, as if perfection of detail could somehow guarantee survival. And then the trains came, or trucks, and the soldiers were moved toward the ports, toward the great transport ships that would carry them across the Atlantic to England, or through the Mediterranean toward North Africa, or across the Pacific to islands where the fighting was already underway. The troop transports themselves became small floating worlds, vastly overcrowded, poorly ventilated, seasickness spreading through the holds like a contagion. Men lay in narrow bunks, stacked 4 or 5 high, swaying in the ocean swell. The air was thick with the smell of too many bodies, of diesel and salt water and human illness. The Navy tried to maintain some semblance of order, of routine. There were muster drills and lifeboat assignments, though everyone understood that in a real crisis, evacuation would be chaos. The food service on the transports was often poor: biscuits, corned beef, weak coffee. The novelty of ocean travel, for men who had mostly known landlocked America, wore off quickly in the face of discomfort and uncertainty. And yet, even aboard the transports, the abundance of the American war machine was evident in a certain way. There were enough ships. The Navy was strong enough that the risk of submarine attack, while real and ever-present, was manageable. The medical services were organized and present. The men were not starving. They were seasick and anxious and far from home, but they were not suffering the kind of deprivation that German soldiers had already begun to normalize. The training camps had prepared them physically and mentally, or so the doctrine assumed, but they were embarking toward a kind of combat experience that no amount of stateside training could fully prepare them for. They carried with them the confidence of a nation with seemingly limitless resources and the fragility of young men about to encounter real, organized violence for the first time. Before a single shot was fired in anger, before the first man fell in any of the great battles that would define their generation, both the German infantryman and the American soldier were already dressed for fundamentally different wars. And if you paid close attention to what they wore, not just the cut of a uniform or the color of a helmet, but the deliberate choices woven into every layer, you could see entire philosophies translated into cloth and leather and metal. The German soldier, the Lancer, wore wool. Not a small accent of wool, but wool as the foundational textile of nearly everything that kept him warm. The Feldgrau uniform itself, that distinctive grey-green that had been standard since the First World War, was woven from coarse wool blends that had been refined through decades of hard experience on European battlefields. Over time, as the war ground on and materials grew scarce, the quality of that wool degraded, becoming rougher and thinner, but the commitment to the material remained. Beneath the tunic lay wool undergarments. The greatcoat, the mantelle, was heavy wool, designed for the brutal winters of Central Europe, where German soldiers had fought since the Napoleonic Wars, and where they would soon fight again in Russia. The boots were leather, quality leather, in the early years. The Wehrmacht's jack boots and marching boots were constructed from proper leather uppers with thick leather soles, stitched and nailed together in a way that demanded skilled craftsmen and time. These boots were made to last if cared for, made to carry a man across vast distances, made to be polished to a mirror shine on parade grounds where discipline itself was the point. There was something almost medieval about German infantry kit in this regard. It relied on animal products, on craft tradition, on the notion that a soldier's equipment was an extension of his bearing and his oath. The leather would crack in extreme cold. The seams would eventually fail, but those problems would be solved by the soldier's own maintenance, his own diligence, his own understanding that his gear reflected his character. The American infantryman, by contrast, was dressed for a very different kind of war. His uniform was cotton twill, a material far more closely associated with work clothes and civilian comfort than with military tradition. The olive drab color was practical, certainly, less formal than the German grey-green, almost apologetic in its plainness. Cotton twill breathes better than wool in warm weather. It's lighter. It wrinkles less badly when packed into a duffel bag and transported across an ocean. There was something almost civilian about the American approach to uniform cloth, as if the soldier was still, underneath it all, an American worker or farmer who had been handed a shirt and told to keep moving. The American boot was rubber-soled, low-cut or moderately high depending on the year and theatre of war. These were not the jack boots of the Prussian tradition. They were practical, mass-produced boots that could be manufactured in enormous quantities by American industrial facilities that had experience making shoes for a consumer market. The rubber soles wore through faster than leather would have, certainly, but they could be replaced. They could be manufactured in millions. There was no craft mystique to the American boot. It was designed to be adequate, interchangeable, and reproducible at scale. Look at those two choices side by side for a moment and consider what they reveal. German kit was built around durability and personal responsibility. The wool and leather would last a very long time if properly maintained, which meant the soldier had to be invested in his own equipment. It had to matter to him. It had to be something he understood and could repair with basic tools. American kit was built around replaceability and logistical abundance. When something wore out, you requisitioned a replacement. The system didn't depend on the individual soldier's skill or dedication. It depended on the machine behind him, the vast industrial apparatus that could simply manufacture more. The German soldier carried his equipment in leather and canvas webbing that had been designed and refined through 2 world wars. His pack, his ammunition pouches, his entrenching tool carrier, all of these were connected in an integrated system that had been thought through by military engineers who had spent decades solving the problem of how to carry everything a man needed into combat. The leather would require care. The webbing would need to be checked for rot, but once properly assembled, the kit had a certain logic to it, a certain elegance even. The American soldier carried the M1928 pack, or, later in the war, various other configurations that emphasized quick distribution of gear and ease of resupply. Ammunition came in standardized bandoliers and boxes that could be rapidly distributed. Rations came in standardized boxes. Everything was designed to flow through a supply chain, to be counted and inventoried, to be replaced when depleted. There was less of the craftsman's touch and more of the factory manager's logic. The helmets tell a similar story. The German Stahlhelm, the steel helmet that had first appeared in 1916, was a marvel of engineering. A deep, protective bowl of steel with a distinctive brim that deflected shrapnel and blast. It was heavy, it was hot in summer, but it was built to protect, and German soldiers understood it as a symbol of their military identity. The American M1 helmet, adopted in 1941, was similarly designed and similarly effective, but it arrived from an industrial tradition that was different. It was manufactured at tremendous scale. Millions upon millions were produced. It was seen not as a craft object, but as a consumable piece of military equipment that happened to protect the head. When you begin to see American military equipment through this lens, not as inferior or superior, but as expressions of fundamentally different approaches to the problem of equipping an army, a clearer picture emerges. The American army believed in overwhelming logistical abundance, in replaceability, in the principle that you could afford to lose equipment because you could manufacture more of it. The German army, by contrast, believed in durability, in maintenance, in the principle that each piece of equipment mattered, and that the soldier's relationship to his gear reflected something essential about military virtue. These weren't neutral choices. They flowed from different histories, different resources, different national characters. Germany had always had to be careful with materials. Its wars had always been constrained by scarcity. The concept of replacing something rather than fixing it was almost foreign to the Prussian tradition. America, meanwhile, had emerged as an industrial superpower partly because it had always believed in replacement and disposal and constant manufacturing renewal. That's what an industrial culture does. It replaces things. On a cold morning in an Eastern European field in 1941, a German Lanzer in wool and leather, boots that would last if he cared for them, began the long retreat that would eventually take him across thousands of kilometers and end in surrender. That same morning, on the other side of the world, an American soldier in cotton twill and rubber-soled boots was still in training camp, still learning how to be a soldier, still part of a vast machine that was only beginning to understand what it would need to do. Neither uniform was particularly comfortable. Both would be tested against cold and heat, mud and dust, the salt water of ocean crossings and the blood that came with the terrible intimacy of close combat. The leather would crack, the cotton would tear, the rubber soles would wear through, the wool would itch. But what's worth sitting with for a moment is the recognition that these choices, wool or cotton, leather or rubber, craft or industrial replacement, meant that when these two armies finally met on the same battlefields, they were meeting not just as military organizations, but as expressions of two different ways of thinking about how the world should work. Beyond the uniforms and the firearms, beyond the squad structures and the tactics that would meet on frozen ground and in summer wheat, there existed another kind of war entirely, one fought not with bullets, but with supply chains, with kitchens and warehouses, with the slow, grinding mathematics of feeding millions of hungry men. And in this quieter struggle, the two armies revealed something about themselves that no training manual could fully capture. The American soldier, by and large, ate well. Not happily always, and certainly not with the variety that a soldier might have craved during long deployments, but consistently, predictably, and in quantities that would have seemed almost lavish to soldiers on the other side. The standard field ration for the American infantry evolved during the war into what became known as the C ration, a carefully engineered triumph of industrial food science that bore the fingerprints of American mass production at every level. These came in cardboard boxes, each one containing an entire meal, canned meat or meat products, crackers, chocolate, cigarettes, instant coffee powder, and a small wrapped piece of candy or gum. The genius of the system lay not in its flavor, which American soldiers would mock with characteristic humor, but in its reliability. A soldier could know, with absolute certainty, that no matter where he was being sent, what the weather might do, or how far behind the supply trucks might fall, there would be something to eat. The famous ham and eggs ration, nicknamed by troops as ham and, well, perhaps the less flattering name reflected the reality more accurately. But it was there, it was edible, it could sustain a man through a day of fighting. And perhaps more importantly, the supply lines that brought these rations forward were themselves a kind of technological marvel. American logistics in the Second World War became, over time, a grinding machine of efficiency. Trucks arrived in vast convoys. Supply depots were established and re-established as the front moved forward. By the time American forces had pushed into France and beyond, the system had been refined through trial and error in North Africa, through costly lessons in Sicily, through the grinding mathematics of island hopping in the Pacific. A soldier might not always have what he wanted, but he would have what he needed. The American approach to war was, in many respects, an extension of American industrial capacity applied to the problem of keeping millions of young men fed, armed, and moving forward. Consider, if you will, what this meant in practical terms. An American infantryman in the winter of 1944, dug in somewhere in the Ardennes or preparing for another push into Germany, could expect his rations to arrive regularly. They might be monotonous, day after day of the same canned meat, the same hard biscuits, but they arrived. This wasn't accident. It was the result of deliberate planning, of an entire system devoted to the proposition that an army marches on its stomach, and that American industrial strength could be converted into the simple fact of regular meals reaching the front lines. The German soldier, by contrast, lived in an increasingly different reality. The German army, the Wehrmacht, had been built on different assumptions rooted in the notion of fast wars, of quick victories that would solve the supply problem by conquest and plunder, rather than by systematic production and distribution. The blitzkrieg strategy that had worked so devastatingly in Poland and France had rested partly on the idea that wars would be won quickly, that territory would be seized, that supplies could be extracted from conquered lands. The early years of the war, when German forces were advancing, when new territories were coming under German control, had allowed the system to function, albeit with increasing strain. But by the time we arrive at the later years of the war, by 1943, 1944, certainly by 1945, the assumption of victory had long since evaporated. The supply lines that fed the German army were stretched across vast distances. The production facilities that might have replaced worn-out vehicles and equipment were increasingly targeted by Allied bombing, and the territories that might have provided food were either already depleted or contested, or both. The German soldier's ration, when it arrived, was different in character. It emphasized dried goods, hard bread, canned meat products, but it arrived less frequently, in smaller quantities, and with an underlying anxiety that somehow, somewhere, the system might break down entirely. The German field ration, or Verpflegungssatz, had been designed with efficiency in mind, to provide maximum calories and nutrition in the smallest possible package. There were variations for different seasons and circumstances, but the fundamental reality was that a German soldier was expected to get by on less than his American counterpart. This might have been acceptable in a war that lasted weeks or months. It became a different matter in a war that lasted years. As the conflict wore on, as Germany's enemies closed in from both east and west, as the industrial capacity of the nation became increasingly consumed with the immediate demands of combat production, the supply lines grew thinner. Stories emerged of units subsisting on increasingly meager rations, of soldiers making do with less, of the slow corrosion of morale that came not from fear of death, but from the creeping certainty that one was gradually going hungry. Think for a moment about what this difference meant. An American soldier, however tired or afraid, could feel the weight of his nation's industrial might in every sea ration that reached his hands. There was something reassuring about it, something that whispered, even in the darkness of combat, that his country had the resources to sustain him, that this war was being fought with the full force of American production turned toward the simple goal of keeping its soldiers alive and fed. It was a tangible reminder, in the midst of chaos and danger, that he was part of something vast and powerful, something that could project its will across an ocean and maintain supply lines that stretched from American factories to foxholes in Europe. The German soldier, conversely, lived in an increasingly different psychological reality. As the years of war accumulated, as the rations became thinner or more sporadic, there developed an underlying awareness that the system was straining, that something was perhaps coming undone. It was not merely hunger, though that might certainly have been part of it, but rather the sense that the machinery that sustained the army, and by extension the nation, was being worn down by the very act of waging total war. The German soldier, particularly those who had served for years on the Eastern Front before being transferred west, carried within them a kind of weariness that went beyond mere physical fatigue. The logistics of supply also reflected differences in philosophy about war itself. The American approach, massive, redundant, designed to ensure that no soldier would lack for essentials, spoke to an assumption that wars were won by overwhelming force, by outproducing your enemy, by outmaneuvering them through superior resources applied methodically over time. The German approach, built on assumptions of rapid victory and territorial conquest, had become increasingly misaligned with the actual war being fought. The consequence was a slow divergence. As the conflict deepened, American logistics improved, became more efficient, more capable of supporting sustained operations far from home. German logistics, by contrast, deteriorated, not suddenly, but gradually, like a machine running without replacement parts, wearing down piece by piece. By the later stages of the war, German forces in the West often depended on captured American rations, a small but telling detail that spoke to the underlying trajectory of the conflict. A German soldier might eat from an American sea ration box and understand, in that simple act, something about the trajectory of the war itself. It was, in its way, a form of surrender already written into the material circumstances of survival. The American, meanwhile, continued forward, sustained by the steady stream of supplies that represented his country's commitment to the war, and perhaps more fundamentally, to the proposition that technology and organization could be applied to the problem of keeping people alive even in the midst of mechanized death. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the Norman coast transformed into something neither the German defenders nor the American invaders had truly rehearsed for in their separate training regimens. The landing craft approached through a grey, churning English Channel, their hulls heavy with the weight of nearly 2 million men who would ultimately pour onto those beaches and inland. For the American infantryman crouched in the dark belly of his LST or Higgins boat, the theoretical knowledge of combined arms warfare he'd studied in his manual suddenly became terrifyingly real. The German soldier, meanwhile, whether a young conscript manning a concrete pillbox or a grizzled Eastern Front veteran reassigned to the Atlantic Wall, faced something his doctrine had taught him to expect, but his instincts struggled to comprehend: the sheer, overwhelming material and numerical presence of an enemy he could not push back through superior tactics alone. What unfolded across those first hours and days was perhaps the most direct collision between the two infantry traditions we have traced through this long night. The American assault waves, trained in the standardized methods of mass mobilization, came ashore in organized chaos, their Garand rifles ready, but their shock and disorientation genuine. The German defenders, positioned in depth and trained in the art of defensive fire discipline, responded with machine gun fire, the MG-42 and MG-34 performing precisely as their doctrine intended, creating interlocking fields that turned the beaches into slaughterhouses. Yet for all the German training and preparation, the sheer numbers, the naval gunfire support, and the aerial cover that the American forces possessed meant that German discipline, however exquisitely executed, could not hold indefinitely against weight of material. The American soldiers who survived that initial passage, those who waded through the surf at Omaha and Utah, Gold and Sword beaches, found themselves in a landscape that would utterly frustrate everything their training had taught them about infantry combat. The bocage, the Norman hedgerows, rose before them like an intimate, verdant maze. Each field was separated from the next by earthen banks crowned with dense hedging that had stood for centuries, taller than a man, thick enough to stop a bullet, and perfect for concealment. The American infantry manual had envisioned warfare across open ground where the volume of fire from a squad armed with Garands could be brought to bear, where the principles of fire and maneuver could be executed with efficiency. Instead, the infantry found itself fighting through a landscape that negated the very advantages they possessed. The Garand's semi-automatic fire, so carefully standardized and relied upon, meant little when visibility extended only 20 or 30 yards. Machine gun fire, the German answer, suddenly became almost academic in such terrain. Both sides were reduced to close quarters, confused engagements where training meant far less than luck, aggression, and willingness to move through the vegetation ahead. The German defenders, by contrast, found their own doctrine challenged in peculiar ways. The hedgerow country demanded neither the sweeping mobile tactics of blitzkrieg nor the elaborate defense in depth of prepared positions. What it required was something closer to the grim, patient warfare of the Eastern Front. Small unit cohesion, the ability to hold ground regardless of envelopment, and an acceptance that each hedgerow might be your last stand. German NCOs and junior officers, many of them battle-hardened from years in Russia, adapted with a grim competence. They established defensive positions in depth within the bocage, used their superior understanding of initiative and decentralized command to respond to American pressure, and often held ground through sheer force of will long after a less disciplined army might have broken. The meeting of these two armies in the hedgerows revealed something unexpected about both. The American infantryman, assumed by German doctrine to be less flexible and more dependent on heavy firepower, proved capable of remarkable improvisation. Soldiers devised the Rhino tank, Sherman tanks, fitted with hedgerow-cutting devices forged from German beach obstacles, a solution that emerged from practical necessity rather than strategic planning. Infantry officers and sergeants, trained in manuals but not in this specific terrain, adapted their tactics almost hour by hour, learning that the bocage required different approaches than any training ground could have provided. They learned to send squads around hedgerows rather than through them. They learned to use artillery and air support differently in dense terrain. They learned, in essence, to fight differently than they had been taught, and to do so under fire. The German defenders, meanwhile, discovered that their doctrine's emphasis on individual initiative and mission-oriented command meant that even as the American forces pushed them back, they could continue to fight effectively in small groups. A German squad commander, armed with knowledge of his terrain and understanding of his commander's intent rather than detailed instructions, could establish a new defensive position with minimal coordination with neighboring units. This allowed German resistance to persist even as larger tactical plans collapsed. Yet this same decentralization, so useful in retreat and delay, could not ultimately overcome the fact that the Germans were fighting against vastly superior numbers and resources. For every German soldier who adapted and held, there were 20 American soldiers arriving to replace the one who had fallen. The blockade fighting, which would persist for weeks as the American forces pushed inland from their beachheads, represented a kind of grinding attrition that neither army's pre-invasion training had fully prepared them for. The German soldier, hardened by years of Eastern Front warfare, could sustain combat losses that might break a less experienced army. The American soldier, fresh, well-supplied, and arriving in apparently endless waves, could absorb the frightful casualties of close quarters fighting through bocage, because there was always another man, another squad, another division waiting to step forward. Where the German tradition emphasized discipline and the efficient use of force, the American approach increasingly relied on volume and replacement. It was not a matter of superior tactics meeting inferior ones, rather, it was two completely different approaches to warfare colliding in terrain that nullified the careful lessons both had learned before ever arriving on that grey Norman coast. As the days passed and the bridgehead expanded, something else became apparent. The American system, designed for mass mobilization and rapid training, meant that individual soldiers had less training in the fundamentals of infantry combat than their German counterparts. Yet that same system, because it rested on industrial capacity and seemingly infinite replacement, could absorb losses and keep pushing. The German system, which prided itself on creating superior individual soldiers through rigorous training and selection, found itself unable to replace losses at anything like the rate they were being incurred. A German squad that lost 3 men might wait weeks for replacements, and those replacements would likely be drawn from older men, younger boys, or men recovering from wounds on the Eastern Front. An American squad that lost 3 men might receive 3 replacements within days, men who, while less experienced than their German counterparts, were healthy, adequately trained, and ready to continue the fight. What emerged in Normandy, then, was less a test of superior tactical doctrine than a grinding demonstration of how 2 completely different systems would respond to the chaos of sustained combat. The German army proved it could defend ferociously, that its discipline and training and understanding of defensive warfare could inflict tremendous casualties even against overwhelming numerical odds. The American army proved it could absorb those casualties, learn on the fly, adapt its tactics to circumstances that no manual could have anticipated, and continue pushing forward. Neither could do what the other did quite so well. The German could not have replaced his casualties, or supplied an offensive of American scale. The American, fighting in smaller numbers and without the benefit of years of combat experience, might have been pushed back had he not possessed such overwhelming advantages in material, and had the German army been at full strength. But the German army, by June of 1944, was already stretched thin, already bleeding from the Eastern Front, and increasingly unable to sustain the kind of intensity of warfare that the American arrival at Normandy now demanded. Once the landing craft had disgorged their men onto the Norman beaches, once the tide of American soldiers had pushed inland past the smoking wreckage and the fallen, they encountered something that no amount of training footage or tactical briefing could have truly prepared them for: the bocage, the hedgerows, ancient tangled walls of hawthorn and blackthorn and elm, thick as a man's body, running in a seemingly endless maze across the Normandy landscape, each one a potential fortress, each gap a killing ground. And waiting behind these green barriers, with patience that came from long practice in defensive warfare, were German soldiers who understood something fundamental about holding ground. The German infantry had spent years learning how to defend, from their positions along the Atlantic Wall, through countless exercises in the doctrine of active defense. They had internalized a principle that ran counter to everything the Allies assumed. The Germans did not intend to hold every inch of territory. Instead, they prepared interlocking fields of fire, zones of death that could be observed and controlled from strong points positioned hundreds of meters back. When an American unit found itself pressing through a gap in the bocage, they were not facing a wall of men. They were walking into a carefully constructed killing zone where German machine gunners had calculated exactly how many meters they would need to engage targets. The MG-42, that fearsome precision instrument we traced earlier, was the spine of this defense. Mounted on a low bipod, or sometimes in a captured French position, it could maintain a rate of fire so rapid that many American soldiers swore, with genuine conviction, that they were being fired upon by multiple guns, when in fact, only one German gunner stood behind the weapon. The Germans, shaped by their inherited doctrine, did something that would prove both their strength and, eventually, their undoing in Normandy. They maintained fire discipline. This meant that machine gunners would hold their fire until American soldiers had committed themselves to an assault, until they were truly committed to crossing open ground, and then the guns would open up with the intention not merely of inflicting casualties, but of stopping the attack cold, of making the very ground itself hostile. A German soldier behind a machine gun in the bocage understood his role in the grander scheme. He was buying time. Time for reserves to come up, time for artillery to rain down on the attackers, time to set conditions for a counterattack that might throw the Americans back. This was active defense, and it required discipline that verged on the aesthetic. Waiting, watching, holding fire, then unleashing it with surgical precision. But the American infantry, and particularly the junior officers and non-commissioned officers who led squads and platoons through these hedgerows, possessed something different. Not better, not worse, but fundamentally different. An adaptability born from a different cultural relationship to order and hierarchy, where a German soldier would look to his section leader for exact guidance on every decision. An American sergeant or young officer, working within a much flatter command structure, was empowered and indeed expected to make tactical decisions on the spot. This did not always serve them well. Early casualties were catastrophic because American units, trained for open warfare and frontal assaults, initially tried to batter their way through the bocage as though it were merely an obstacle to be overcome by sheer will and firepower. They would attempt frontal assaults through the gaps, exactly where German fire discipline anticipated them, and they would be cut down in numbers that shocked even hardened veterans. But something remarkable occurred. As the hedgerow campaign progressed through July and into August, American junior leaders began to adapt. They began to improvise. Instead of assaulting through the gaps, they began to use tools and techniques that seemed almost crude beside the careful geometry of German defensive doctrine. Engineers with flamethrowers would work their way along the hedgerows, burning back the vegetation to deny German defenders cover. Tanks, struggling through the broken terrain, were suffering terribly when German anti-tank guns could pick them off from prepared positions. So American tankers and engineers together conceived of a solution that spoke to the essentially pragmatic American approach to war. They took captured German beach obstacles, metal angles and spikes that the Germans had planted on the beaches to destroy landing craft. These were welded to the front of tanks, and these modified machines, which became known as Rhino tanks or the Kulin hedgerow cutters after the engineer who championed them, could literally tear through the bocage. A 5-ton mass of metal, driven by 400 horsepower engines, pushing through a living hedgerow, tearing it apart, collapsing it, breaking it open. It was not elegant. It violated every principle of economical use of resources. A German officer observing this would have found it almost absurd, the wasteful use of heavy armor to solve what was fundamentally an infantry and tactical problem. But it worked. And more importantly, it revealed a deep truth about how these two armies thought differently. The German approach was to perfect the system, to build the doctrine correctly, to position the forces precisely. The American approach was to say, if the system isn't working, let's apply more raw power to it. Let's throw resources at it until it breaks. This wasn't a failure of German thinking. Indeed, in a different context, with different resources, German precision would have been overwhelming. But in the bocage, where American industry could manufacture Rhino tanks and the American supply system could get them forward, where American units could experiment and adapt without fear that a small failure would disrupt an entire carefully balanced operational plan, the American way of warfare proved more flexible. German soldiers in the bocage, and we should pause here to consider what they experienced, were conducting a masterclass in defensive fire discipline under impossible circumstances. They understood that they could not win this fight. There were too many Americans, too much material coming ashore every day, too many ships, too much ammunition. But a German sergeant commanding a machine gun position in a hedgerow was doing his duty exactly as he understood it. He was holding ground, he was inflicting casualties, he was buying time, and when time ran out, when the position became untenable, when Americans with flamethrowers or tanks with welded obstacles were coming at him from two directions, he would either pull back to the next prepared line, or, increasingly as the summer went on, he would be captured or killed. The hedgerow fighting was not a contest of doctrines meeting in honorable competition. It was a collision between two approaches to warfare, one that depended on precision and discipline and limited resources, and one that depended on adaptability and abundance and, ultimately, overwhelming material superiority. The autumn forests of Western Germany held a particular kind of darkness that seemed to accumulate in the folds between the trees, where the canopy grew so thick that even at midday soldiers moved through a perpetual twilight. The Hurtgen forest, a vast, difficult expanse of densely packed timber and ravines stretching across the German-Belgian border, would become one of the least understood and most brutal encounters of the entire European campaign, a place where all the doctrinal differences between the American and German armies seemed to converge and intensify into something almost primal. From September through November of 1944, American forces drove again and again into those woods, and each advance was met by a German defense that seemed to draw strength from something deeper than mere tactical positioning. Consider for a moment what the Germans brought to this particular fight. By the autumn of 1944, the Wehrmacht was a severely depleted force across much of the front, yet the troops facing the Americans in the Hurtgen possessed something that fresh recruits simply could not match. Many of these men had served on the Eastern Front. They had learned survival in conditions so extreme that the cold and wet and endless horror of forest combat in the Rhineland felt, if not familiar, then at least manageable within a framework of suffering they already understood. These were men who had seen entire armadas of infantry disappear into the Russian steppes. They had learned to hold ground with almost nothing, to extract maximum cost from every assault, to read terrain with an almost unconscious precision. The German army's philosophy of mission tactics, where officers provided intent rather than detailed orders, allowing smaller units considerable autonomy, meant that these veteran soldiers could adapt and react with remarkable speed, even as their overall numbers dwindled and their supplies became increasingly scarce. The American forces entering the Hurtgen, by contrast, were in the midst of a profound transformation. The early panic and costly mistakes of North Africa had given way to something more confident, more assured. By the autumn of 1944, American divisions had learned the fundamentals of combined arms warfare through hard experience. They had refined their techniques in Normandy and through the hedgerows. They were, at this moment in the war, probably the most rapidly improving army on the continent, their confidence rising in direct proportion to their material abundance. And yet confidence, particularly in a place like the Hurtgen Forest, could become a kind of vulnerability. The American way of war relied increasingly on firepower, on artillery, on air support, on the sheer volume of ammunition and supplies that could be poured into a problem until it dissolved. But the Hurtgen was a place where these advantages became strangely muted. Dense forest meant that air support was nearly impossible. Artillery rounds detonating in the treetops created an additional hazard, raining wooden splinters down on men in trenches and foxholes. The terrain channeled movement into narrow corridors where firepower meant less than it did in open ground. What unfolded over those autumn weeks revealed something almost tragic about the encounter between these two armies at this particular moment. The Americans would mount an attack, advancing through the woods with determination and supporting firepower. German defenders, often occupying carefully prepared positions that took advantage of natural features and the forest's inherent defensibility, would inflict heavy casualties through disciplined defensive fire. Then, as American tactics evolved, as units began to move more carefully, to use the forest's cover more effectively, to coordinate their movements with greater subtlety, the Germans would fall back, sometimes in deliberate fighting retreats that extracted a further price. The mathematics of attrition began to work against the Germans in ways that even their discipline and experience could not fully overcome. American divisions had replacements arriving regularly. German divisions did not. American soldiers could be resupplied with ammunition, food, and winter clothing. German soldiers increasingly could not. Through October and into early November, the Hurtgen Forest became a grinding, exhausting ordeal for both sides, though in rather different ways. For American troops, the forest brought unexpected hardship. Many had imagined that by this stage of the war, victory was essentially assured. The Germans were being pushed back. The material advantage was overwhelming. Yet the woods seemed to nullify so much of that advantage. Men fought at close range, sometimes unable to see more than a few yards ahead. Friendly fire incidents occurred with terrible regularity. The cold and wet seeped into everything. Trench foot became a serious problem. Psychological exhaustion mounted as men realized that the forest seemed almost infinite, that enemy fire could come from anywhere, that progress could be measured in yards at enormous human cost. Company strengths dwindled not only from casualties, but from exhaustion and the onset of conditions like trench foot, and what would later be understood more clearly as combat stress. American commanders, accustomed to fighting wars of movement and maneuver, seemed uncertain how to adapt to this kind of static, positional warfare in difficult terrain. For German defenders, the Hurtgen represented something different, though no less difficult. These men were fighting in their homeland now, or nearly so. The Rhineland was German soil, and the war had come to its borders. There was a certain grim clarity to that situation. They knew that their strategic situation was hopeless in the larger sense, yet here they could still trade space for time, still inflict casualties, still delay the inevitable. The discipline that had been trained into them across years of service held firm even as the broader context of their struggle deteriorated. German soldiers were experienced at falling back in good order, at maintaining unit cohesion even in retreat, at establishing new defensive lines with minimal resources. Yet the Hurtgen was also a place where that experience was tested in ways that strain any system. The forest was harsh, the conditions were degrading as winter approached, and the steady, grinding pressure of American attacks, even when costly, was relentless. German units were being worn down not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through a kind of patient attrition that reflected, perhaps, a new American understanding of how to fight this particular kind of war. By the time the Hurtgen campaign wound down in late November, both armies had suffered dramatically. American casualties exceeded 24,000 men, with rates of psychiatric breakdown and cold-weather casualties that shocked medical services. For a forest that was never strategically vital, the cost seemed staggering. German casualties were harder to quantify with precision, but they were substantial as well, though expressed in different terms. Divisions reduced to shadows, veteran soldiers killed or captured, and an overall erosion of fighting capacity that could not be easily replaced. The German army had demonstrated, once again, that discipline and experience could extract an extraordinary price from attackers, even attackers with superior resources. But the Americans had also learned something important, that they could push through difficult terrain and difficult enemy resistance, that even when their material advantages were muted, their training, adaptability, and replacement capacity would eventually prevail. The Hurtgen represented, in many ways, a pivot point in how these two armies would meet in the final phase of the war. American confidence, tested but not broken, would emerge strengthened. German resilience, impressive in its consistency, would also prove to be finite. And then, as if to test these lessons in a single, enormous convulsion, the Germans would launch one final massive counteroffensive that would shake American confidence, even as it demonstrated, conclusively, that the war was approaching its end. The Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, would come in December, just weeks after the Hurtgen campaign concluded, and in those frozen weeks, the true nature of the contest between these two armies would be laid bare in ways that neither side could have fully anticipated. The Bulge itself began on December 16th in darkness and fog, with German forces attacking through the Ardennes region in Belgium, with a desperation that carried the weight of everything that had come before. German commanders had concentrated considerable forces for this offensive, drawing from reserves and from sectors of the front where the fighting had slowed. For a few days, the assault seemed almost to recall the old German way of war, the rapid penetration, the attempt at encirclement, the coordination of multiple corps in a concentrated blow. American forces, somewhat thinly spread in the Ardennes sector, were driven back with considerable speed. Tank battles erupted across snowy ground. German panzer columns pushed westward. For a moment, it seemed as though the German army might still possess the capacity to alter the trajectory of the war. Yet what emerged over those cold December weeks was something that revealed, with terrible clarity, the fundamental imbalance that now existed. German forces had achieved tactical surprise and initial operational success, but they could not sustain it. American reserves, mobilized with impressive speed, began flowing toward the penetration. Bad weather that had initially grounded American air forces cleared enough to allow fighter bombers to operate. And as the days passed, American confidence, which had been shaken but not destroyed by the initial assault, solidified into grim determination. German columns that had advanced rapidly began to encounter American units that had reorganized, units that had learned to move quickly toward threats, units that had learned to defend in depth and depth again. The American ability to concentrate forces, to supply them, to move them rapidly from one sector to another, proved decisive in ways that mere numerical superiority alone could not explain. From the German perspective, the Ardennes offensive revealed the brutal calculus of material warfare at this stage of the conflict. Panzer divisions that had been assembled with considerable effort had fuel for only a few days of intensive operations. Ammunition was rationed. Replacement troops, increasingly drawn from non-traditional sources and with minimal training, could not maintain unit cohesion under sustained pressure. The weather that had enabled the initial assault soon became another enemy, as snow and cold degraded equipment and slowed movement. German soldiers fought with the same discipline and courage that had characterized their army throughout the war, yet they were fighting against something more than American military might. They were fighting against American industrial capacity, made manifest in the form of endless ammunition supplies, replacement soldiers and equipment, and a logistical system so robust that it seemed to operate almost independently of the immediate tactical situation. What the Ardennes campaign demonstrated, in ways that the Hurtgen had begun to suggest, was that the era of German infantry dominance was truly over. Individual German units could still fight with extraordinary effectiveness. Small unit leadership remained superb. The inherited traditions of Prussian discipline and German military culture continued to shape behavior, even as the strategic context of that behavior became almost meaningless. Yet the American army, for all its relative inexperience and apparent doctrinal contradictions, had evolved into something formidable in its own right. It was an army that had learned to move quickly, to concentrate forces, to support them lavishly, and to sustain pressure even in the face of unexpected enemy action. It was an army that could absorb shock and recover. Yet beneath all these structured differences, beneath the doctrine and the carefully designed machines of war, there lived in every soldier something far more primal and far more fragile. When a German Lanzer, whose training had been hardened by Prussian discipline and whose mind had been shaped to think in terms of mission and maneuver, found himself pinned in an ice-crusted trench outside Stalingrad, watching his breath crystallize in air so cold it felt like breathing broken glass. What he felt was not the abstract philosophy of German military tradition. He felt cold, he felt hunger, he felt the ancient, wordless animal fear that knows no doctrine, no language, no border between nations. The letters that survive from both armies tell us something that no tactical manual ever could. A letter written by a young American from Iowa, carefully folded into an envelope and sent back to his mother before the Normandy invasion, reads with a particular kind of quietness. He did not write about his confidence in American industrial superiority or the superiority of the semi-automatic rifle. Instead, he wrote about missing home cooking, about wondering if he would see the farm again, about being sorry that he had not told his father he loved him before enlisting. In almost the same words, a letter discovered decades later in a German archives from a Wehrmacht soldier in France speaks of missing his wife's voice, of hoping the war would end before his daughter grew so tall that he would not recognize her. The handwriting is different, the paper is different, the postage is different, but the love is identical. The fear is identical. What happens to a human body and mind when it lives in sustained exhaustion is something that both armies eventually understood, even if they could never quite solve it. An American soldier in the Pacific or in Europe could expect a rotation, a return home after so many points accumulated in service. This was official policy, a recognition that the human mind could only bear so much before it began to fracture. And yet, even with this system in place, men broke. They simply stopped, in the middle of combat, their hands shaking so violently they could no longer hold a rifle. There is a medical term for this from that era, shell shock or combat fatigue, but the words fail to capture what it truly was, which was the simple human nervous system reaching the edge of what it could bear and then stepping over it. German soldiers had no such luxury of rotation. A man conscripted into the Wehrmacht in 1939 might still be fighting in 1945, his body grown thin, his mind grown strange from 6 years of unbroken war. The exhaustion that accumulated across such a span of time was not something that could be fixed by letters from home, or even by the discipline that had been hammered into him since childhood. A German sergeant, perhaps a man who had marched through Poland, fought in France, suffered on the Russian steppes, and then been pushed back, month by month, as the Americans and Russians closed in, carried a different kind of weight. His exhaustion was not fresh, it was seasoned. It was the weariness of someone who had lived with death as a constant neighbor for so long that peace seemed almost impossible to imagine. And what of the shared experience of cold, An American GI in the bulge, watching the thermometer drop below 0 Fahrenheit as snow swirled across the dark fields of Belgium, suffered from frostbite and hypothermia just as German soldiers did. The cold did not ask what army you served. It simply entered through gaps in fabric and leather, through the cracks in boots that had been worn too long, through the moments when you were too exhausted to stay awake and keep moving. Both armies lost men to the cold as much as to bullets. Many soldiers on both sides carried accounts of friends who simply sat down in the snow, surrendered to the warmth that came as the body's final deception, and did not get up again. The question of fear, though, perhaps deserves its own careful space. Is there truly any difference in how fear manifests itself across national lines? A man from Stuttgart who had been trained to believe in order, in duty, in the mission ahead, felt fear in exactly the same way as a man from New York who had been trained to believe in individual initiative and confidence in his equipment. Their fear might have expressed itself differently. The German soldier might have channeled it into rigid obedience, into following orders with precision, because following orders felt safer than thinking. The American soldier might have expressed it through dark humor, through joking with his buddies, through the peculiar gallows wit that American soldiers seemed to possess in abundance. But the underlying sensation was indistinguishable: the racing heart, the tight throat, the sudden clarity that this moment might be the last moment, the desperate wish to be anywhere else. When soldiers from these two armies finally encountered one another directly, face to face, in villages and fields and hedgerows, there were moments of recognition that transcended everything their training had taught them. A German defender holding a position against American advances would sometimes see, in the eyes of the American infantryman across from him, something of himself. Not similarity exactly, but the same fundamental humanity, the same obvious fear, the same exhaustion that made the eyes look older than the face. After combat, when prisoners were taken on either side, there were often moments of unexpected kindness. An American soldier, given a prisoner to guard, might share a cigarette. A German might warn an American where landmines had been laid. A small gesture toward preventing more death when the combat itself was over. Hunger, too, was a shared vocabulary of suffering, though it manifested differently on each side. American soldiers, for all their abundance of supply, still knew the gnawing sensation of food that was insufficient or unappetizing. Field rations, however plentiful, were repetitive and often nearly inedible when eaten cold in a combat zone. A tin of canned meat, a package of hard biscuits, powdered coffee mixed with water from a helmet. These sustained the body but rarely satisfied the mouth or the mind. German soldiers, particularly in the later years of the war, knew true hunger. The supply lines were broken, rations were reduced. Men fought while their bodies were slowly consuming themselves, while their weight dropped to skeletal proportions. Yet both still thought of food constantly. Both dreamed of meals they had eaten before the war. Both spoke in letters and conversations of food with an intensity that might seem comic to someone who had never experienced genuine want. The sleep deprivation was perhaps most democratic of all. Whether you were a German soldier assigned to guard duty in the Russian winter, watching for an attack that might never come, or an American soldier moving through the hedgerows of Normandy, never quite certain when the next German defensive position would emerge, you carried a bone-deep exhaustion that made everything slightly unreal. The world would sometimes seem to flicker. Your thoughts would become strange and loose. You would find yourself unable to remember what you had eaten that morning, or whether it was morning or afternoon. You would catch yourself nearly falling asleep while standing upright, while moving, while in active combat. This kind of continuous deprivation was a kind of slow torture that neither doctrine nor discipline could prevent. Perhaps most profoundly, both armies experienced grief in remarkably similar ways. When a man who had trained alongside you, who had shared the same jokes and fears and long nights, was suddenly and violently removed from existence, the grief was absolute. There was no comfort in knowing that he had died for his nation or for a noble cause. In the moment of loss, those abstractions meant nothing. You had lost a friend. That friend was no longer alive. That could not be made right by any amount of doctrine or justification. A German squad leader who lost his entire MG-42 team to an American artillery barrage felt exactly what an American sergeant felt when a landmine took half his squad. Grief is grief. It does not recognize uniforms. And yet, in the end, both armies were sustained by something beyond even these fundamental human experiences. There was a kind of strange camaraderie, a bond that formed between men who suffered together, that transcended national identity. An American soldier, looking back decades later on his time in combat, would speak not of defeating the German army, but of his buddies, of the men next to him, of the peculiar brotherhood that formed in foxholes. A German soldier, when interviewed in his old age, would speak in similar terms of the closeness that developed between men when everything else had been stripped away. The enemy was distant, abstract. The man next to you was real. That man was what mattered. By the winter of 1944, as the Ardennes offensive collapsed in the frozen valleys of Belgium, something fundamental had shifted in the nature of German infantry cohesion. The Lancer who had held back the Red Army for 3 grinding years, who had endured the encirclements and the endless retreats across snow and mud, was now fighting not for victory, but for the simple act of survival, and the distinction mattered more than any parade ground doctrine ever could. The men still had their training, still moved through forests with the careful discipline instilled in them since their earliest days, still knew how to read terrain and position a machine gun with practiced efficiency. But the world around them was collapsing at a pace that outstripped even their remarkable capacity for adaptation. The supply lines that had never been quite adequate were now skeletal threads stretched across a continent in convulsion. Ammunition came in smaller and smaller shipments. Winter uniforms that had once been thick with wool were replaced with whatever cloth remained in the Reich's depleted warehouses. Boots wore thin. The horses that had carried supplies across Russia, hundreds of thousands of them, were largely gone now, eaten or exhausted, and the German army had no equivalent to the endless convoys of American trucks that moved steadily across France and into the Rhine Valley. What had once made the German infantry formidable was beginning to dissolve not from battlefield failure alone, though there was plenty of that, but from the simple exhaustion of resources. A German squad in early 1945, if you could find one still intact, might consist of a mixture of exhausted veterans, Hitler Youth children barely old enough to shave, and middle-aged men pulled from factories and offices. The philosophical coherence of the mission tactics system, which had once allowed squad leaders to think for themselves within a larger framework, became harder to maintain when those squad leaders were either dead or so depleted by constant casualties that new men were promoted into positions for which they had almost no preparation. The American advance into Germany itself, meanwhile, had taken on a quality of almost methodical inevitability. The supply situation for American forces had grown so abundant by 1945 that it created an almost surreal contrast with what the German soldiers could muster. An American infantry battalion moving into Germany might have more food in its supply trucks than a German regiment could produce in a month. Ammunition was not rationed. It was applied liberally to any problem that presented itself. The American soldier, who had once been the one struggling with inexperience and uncertainty, was now operating within a system of such overwhelming material advantage that the outcome of any given engagement was often determined before the first shot was fired. What happened in those final months, as American forces pushed deeper into German territory, was less a series of dramatic battles than a slow, grinding process of erosion. German infantry units would establish defensive positions in towns and forests, holding on with the tenacity that seemed almost genetic to them after 5 years of continuous war. And then American forces would simply bypass them, cut off their supply lines, or concentrate such overwhelming firepower that resistance became a futile gesture. The German soldier, fighting now on his own soil, defending his own towns and villages, often found that the population itself was too exhausted, too frightened, or too demoralized to support a prolonged defense. The question that haunts any study of this final period is how much of the German collapse came from military defeat, and how much from a deeper, almost spiritual exhaustion. The Lancer had been told for years that his sacrifice, his suffering, his willingness to endure impossible odds was in service of a grand historical purpose. By 1945, that narrative had become hollow even to those still fighting. Commanders issued orders that everyone knew could not be obeyed. Soldiers received promises of wonder weapons that never arrived. The Hitler Youth divisions, fanatical as they sometimes were, proved more suicidal than militarily effective, and their willingness to fight to the last man often seemed less like courage and more like a kind of collective delusion maintained by exhaustion and propaganda. The American advance, by contrast, maintained its momentum precisely because it could afford to sustain losses that would have shattered a less well-supplied force. When an American unit took casualties, replacements arrived within days. When armor was needed, it appeared. When supply lines grew stretched, the Quartermaster Corps worked miracles of logistics to keep the flow of ammunition, food, and fuel moving forward. There was no romance in this kind of warfare, no room for the kind of individualistic heroism that the German tradition sometimes celebrated. It was grinding, mechanical, and utterly effective. In the Ruhr Valley, in the approaches to Berlin, in the small towns of Bavaria and Swabia, the pattern repeated with almost numbing regularity. German units would hold positions with skill and determination. American forces would concentrate superior firepower and material resources. The Germans would be pressed back, encircled, their retreat routes cut off. Some units dissolved entirely, men simply dropping their weapons and walking back toward their homes. Others fought on with a kind of grim persistence, not because they believed in victory anymore, but because the alternative, surrender to an enemy whose intentions were still uncertain, seemed equally terrifying. Perhaps most poignant was what happened to the German army's vaunted unit cohesion, the bonds between men that had kept them fighting through Stalingrad and Kursk and countless other horrors. In the final months, those bonds began to fray from exhaustion and hopelessness. Men became less concerned with the success of the mission and more concerned with their own survival. The elaborate system of delegation and trust that mission tactics depended on became harder to maintain when you could not feed the men under your command, when you could not give them bullets for their rifles, when you could not promise them anything except more cold and more death. The American GI, moving into Germany in the spring of 1945, was encountering something his training had never quite prepared him for. Not a determined, unified enemy, but a force that was fragmenting from within. Some German units fought with undiminished fury, others surrendered in droves. Entire divisions simply ceased to exist as coherent military organizations. It was not a glorious conclusion to either army's story, but rather the slow, grinding collapse of even the most disciplined military system when it runs out of resources, purpose, and the physical capacity to sustain the effort. What the final months of the war seemed to demonstrate, perhaps, was that even the most sophisticated doctrine, even the most carefully trained and motivated soldiers, cannot overcome the simple mathematics of industrial capacity and logistical superiority. The German infantry had learned to fight with exceptional skill and determination, but they were fighting an American system that simply produced more of everything. More ammunition, more food, more vehicles, more men, more certainty about the future. And as winter turned to spring in 1945, and the forests of Germany grew thick with American soldiers and equipment, the question was no longer whether German infantry could hold territory, but how long they could maintain any organized resistance at all. And so we come to the quiet aftermath, to the fields grown over with grass, to the monuments that stand in rain and snow, to the men who came home and tried to speak of things that words could never quite hold. The German Lanzer and the American GI, so different in training, in doctrine, in the very structure of how they learned to fight. They shared something more fundamental than any manual could teach. They shared the simple, crushing weight of being human in an inhuman circumstance. Consider for a moment what their divergent systems reveal about us, about the human capacity to endure within entirely different frameworks. The German infantry, shaped across generations by Prussian discipline and the inherited weight of military tradition, moved into battle with a clarity of purpose that came from within a structure so tight it became almost a second skin. Each man knew his place in the hierarchy. Each knew precisely what was expected, and perhaps in that certainty there was a kind of comfort, even as the Eastern Front consumed men by the thousands, and the certainty itself became a cage from which there was no escape. The system worked until it didn't, and then it simply broke. The American infantry, by contrast, arrived at the war almost by accident. A nation of civilians suddenly transformed into soldiers through the sheer momentum of industrial mobilization. They came with abundance, with standardized manuals, with an almost naive faith that training could make soldiers of farmers and shopkeepers and factory workers. And somehow, against odds that seemed impossible in those first fumbling campaigns in North Africa, they learned, they adapted, they improvised. The system was loose enough that when doctrine failed, men could still find ways forward. Perhaps that looseness, that built-in flexibility, allowed for a different kind of survival. Yet here lies a profound and gentle mystery. Both armies produced men who were extraordinarily brave. Both produced soldiers who, in the moment of greatest danger, reached for their weapons, not with rage or conviction, but with the simple clarity of someone trying to stay alive and keep his neighbor alive. The German defender in the hedgerows of Normandy, knowing the war was lost, still fought with a discipline that earned the respect of the men who faced him. The American soldier, pressing forward through uncertainty and mud and the constant awareness of his own inexperience, still pressed forward. What explains this? What made these men, shaped so differently, capable of the same kind of sacrifice? Perhaps the answer is older than armies, older than doctrines. Perhaps it lies in something about the human animal itself, that capacity to endure, to function, to find meaning, even in meaninglessness. The man inside the uniform, whether German or American, carried the same basic fears, the same memories of home, the same hunger. He felt the same cold. He experienced the same grief when the man next to him fell. And in those moments of greatest clarity, in those hours when the machinery of war ground most loudly, it was not doctrine that held him in place. It was love. It was duty. It was the simple fact that running would leave his comrades more exposed than staying. We speak often of how different these two armies were, how utterly opposed their systems stood. And this is true. The implications of their differences shaped the course of entire campaigns, cost lives, determined which nations would build the peace and which would live within it. And yet, is there not something almost poignant in the realization that despite these vast differences, both armies produced the same kind of soldier? Both produced men who were afraid and went anyway. Both produced men who were afraid and went anyway. Both produced men who were afraid and went anyway. Both produced men who were afraid and went anyway. Both produced men who were afraid and went anyway. Both produced men who were afraid and went anyway. Who sometimes woke in the night still hearing sounds that were no longer there. The German infantry's emphasis on mission tactics and the autonomy of lower-ranked commanders created a system where individual initiative mattered greatly, and there is nobility in this, the trust placed in a junior sergeant to make decisions that could affect the lives of dozens of men. But it also meant that when things went wrong, when the mission became impossible, there was nowhere to hide from responsibility. And in the closing months of the war, when the Third Reich was collapsing and orders came that made no sense, this same system created a different kind of agony, the knowledge that one's duty and one's survival had become irreconcilable. The American infantry's emphasis on standardization and supply lines created a system where the individual soldier was supported by enormous resources. A GI received better food, better equipment, more ammunition than his German counterpart. And this mattered greatly in the final accounting. But it also meant that the American soldier, for much of the war, was still learning. He was still a student of combat, and being a student while men were dying around you creates its own particular anguish. The knowledge that your inexperience was costing lives, that the man next to you might die because you didn't yet know how to do your job properly. Both systems worked. Both systems failed. Both systems created survivors, and both systems created casualties. And perhaps the deepest truth that emerges from their comparison is this, that the structure around us, the doctrine we're taught, the tools we're given, these matter. They shape outcomes, they determine the texture of victory or defeat, and yet they do not determine who we are at the deepest level. The man remains, beneath the uniform, beneath the doctrine, beneath the historical moment that has claimed him for its purposes. In the decades after the war, many of these men found one another again, across the old lines of battle. German soldiers and American soldiers, meeting at reunions and memorials. What did they find in each other? Often, they found understanding. Not forgiveness exactly, though that came sometimes too, but a deep and quiet recognition that they had both been young, that they had both been terrified, that they had both been remade by an experience so massive that it required the rest of their lives to process. They had been enemies shaped by incompatible systems, and yet they could look at one another and see themselves. The fields where they fought are peaceful now. The foxholes have filled with rain and earth and grass. The hedgerows still stand in Normandy, but now tourists walk them in summer sunshine, wondering what it must have been like, trying to imagine the noise and chaos and fear. Monuments stand in cemeteries, row after row of white crosses and grey stones, arranged with the same precision that both armies brought to their training. And somewhere in those names, preserved in inscription and memory, are the echoes of two different military traditions colliding at their fullest, most terrible intensity. What do they teach us, these armies that fought nothing alike? They teach us that human beings are remarkably adaptable, that we can be shaped by systems vastly different from one another and still produce the same fundamental behaviors: courage, loyalty, creativity in crisis. They teach us that doctrine matters, that the way we organize ourselves and train ourselves has real consequences for real lives. And they teach us, perhaps most importantly, that whatever divides us, whatever systems or ideologies or nations separate us, there remains beneath it all a common humanity that persists even in war. The peace that came after 1945 was hard-won and incomplete. It did not erase what had happened. It did not resurrect those who had fallen. But it created space, finally, for the simple act of living, for the German survivors to rebuild their nation and their lives without the crushing weight of Prussian discipline transformed into something dark, for the American survivors to find peace after the brief, intense education that war had given them, for both to grow old, to raise families, to visit their graves, to pass down stories that fade with each generation, until finally the war becomes history rather than memory. And in that fading, in that gentle recession of lived experience into the quieter realm of the past, there is perhaps a kind of mercy. The endurance these men showed was real and remarkable and worth honoring. But there is also profound relief in the knowledge that such endurance is no longer required of them, that somewhere, in nursing homes and small towns, the last of these soldiers are resting now, that the long exhaustion of their lives is, finally, coming to a close, and with it, a question that needs no answering before sleep comes. What does it mean to have survived what was meant to destroy you? To have lived beyond the moment when living seemed impossible? The fields are quiet now, the war is over, and the men who fought it, in their incompatible uniforms, shaped by their incompatible systems, are at peace at last.